Good morning, everyone. We've got our early joiners are with us, and I'll try and start slowly with the introduction to let a few others join. But really appreciate those of you who are joining us for the second day, and welcome to those of you who weren't able to join us yesterday. This is a really exciting time when we draw together experts and really just brilliant people to talk about topics that are near and dear to the California Earthquake Authority, and that is, hazard, and typically hazard and vulnerability or the physical sciences. But this year we're talking about the social sciences for a very important reason. My name is Janiele Maffei. I'm a structural engineer, and I'm the Chief Mitigation Officer with the California Earthquake Authority. I also manage the research department, but a lot of my time goes towards being the executive director of the California Residential Mitigation Program, and that's the program that runs Earthquake, Brace, and Bolt, which is a grant program for Californians to provide them with funding to retrofit their houses, so to keep their houses on the foundation in the event of an earthquake. And so this social science focus that we have this year is really important because we are so thrilled to announce that in our registration in October, we will be including a supplementary grant for low to moderate income Californians. We're starting with homeowners, so we're not being able to reach out to houses with renters in them quite yet. We have to change legislation to do that. But we're starting out, small, couple hundred houses that we'll be able to do under our supplementary grant program. But a very important one, an important one that speaks right to diversity and equity and inclusion, and which are topics that are rightly so at the tip of our tongues here in certainly in California and in the United States and hopefully in the world. So equity and social justice in residential resilience is much more than just providing funding. You can kind of drop in and drop checks in on everybody, but we recognize from our base program and from our careful study of the issues that's not enough. That we first and foremost need to prove the relevance of the retrofit, of what we're encouraging people to do. We need to be a trusted partner to them. We need to go into their community and find their existing trusted partners and develop relationships. So there's a lot that we know that we need to do. And today and yesterday, we're so excited to be joined by, as I said, these experts and brilliant people with all kinds of information and lessons for us. So yesterday, we started out talking about resilience. What is it? It means a lot of different things to different people. I hear criticism a lot that it's not a word that is well defined, but I don't know about the rest of you, but for the last 15 months, I found resilience unfolding in many ways right before my very eyes. Myself, my company, my husband and I, our marriage. I didn't expect to be 24/7 at this point in our career, but certainly a good lesson for retirement. I saw it in my children, both of my children during this pandemic. They and their wives have delivered grandchildren, and to deliver wearing a mask, to have your family come to hold your baby with a N39 mask on. I have seen resilience in front of me. I've seen resilience in the community around me that is, in fact, low to moderate income in challenges that I have not seen during the pandemic as somebody who's been able to work at home. So resilience, I think, is a concept that is emerging as a much clearer idea. We heard yesterday about community engagement, and we know that's important. But we also know we need to learn a lot about what that means and how we go about that. Yesterday, Anna Marie Jones talked about the entry path for homeowners to resilience, and talked about how we don't necessarily need to drop huge expectations on everyone in California, but rather to provide them with an entry path, an introduction, small steps, and then, of course, as we encourage them to retrofit, lots of support in that effort. So today, we're still talking about resilience, we're still talking about community engagement, but we're going to add a couple of focuses today, and one of them is essentially economics, excuse me, but very much in the category of behavioral economics. And our first speaker is just really in an exciting place and has so much to share with all of us. And then Laurie Schoeman, who has experience with multifamily residential resilience, for natural disasters, and going into the community and working with the community, working with other organizations to provide affordable housing throughout the United States. And then our panelists are representing organizations that are out there around the country doing things similar to what we're doing. Some of them are in the response world as well, but as they operated in that response category, realized that mitigation was something they should also be bringing and working on with these communities. So really fantastic partners for us to share and to learn from. And then this afternoon, Dr. Sara McBride from USGS, who has tremendous experience in communication and has so much to share with us about our kind of sub-theme, which is translating research to practice. You know, we have been sponsors of research. We have done a little bit of research in-house, but predominantly we sponsor research. We join those research efforts. We encourage, we try and outline the things that we need. But if those things come back to us in a binder or now in a digital file and are filed somewhere, and we can't put them to practice, then of course that is money, time, effort, expertise that's not well spent. And so we're in a real implementation stage with a lot of our research. The research that we did with the ATC or FEMA P1100 is being developed into a code that has plan sets that can make seismic retrofits much more affordable and much more accessible. We worked with Peer to quantify how much you reduce the damage for a house that's retrofitted, like we're doing in Earthquake Brace and Bolt. So we can tell people that, yes, in fact, we've studied this. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars for what on average in California is about a $5,500 retrofit. We had another really great program that we did with ATC to create documents that would train claim adjusters and engineers for working on damage assessment and repair methodology for after an earthquake. And we've created training for that. So implementation is an exciting phase to be in with research. And essentially the Earthquake Brace and Bolt program and its supplementary grant are implementation. They're implementation of years of thoughtful work on behalf of residents on how to make housing more resilient to earthquakes. So with that, I am very excited to introduce our first speaker this morning. Carolyn Kousky is executive. Oh, let me get back really quickly. Thank you, Catherine, for the reminder. So Zoom meeting, we are recording, and that's so that any of you have to skip out for another meeting, or if those who couldn't join us, obviously we want to share. We're using Q&A instead of chat, and would really like to encourage Q&A today. And just because it says Q&A doesn't mean that we don't want you to chat. We really would like to hear from you. And so right now, as I introduce Carolyn as she starts up, if any of you would like to throw in, hey, you know, I'm going to call out a friend here, David Waldorf for USGS in Golden, and either this is what I learned yesterday, this is what I'd like to learn, or that's all you have to say. David, you don't have to do it. I'm just calling you out. But you know, we would love to hear who's here, what you're thinking about, if you heard something yesterday. And as you go along today, comments, welcome, comments, welcome. And I'm going to ask from time to time for kind of some specific questions and comments. If you ask a question during a speaker's portion, and we're going to do questions and answers later, we're just going to gather those up. So feel free to throw in a question. CEA folks, we'd love to hear from you as well, particularly if you're involved in our Earthquake Brace and Bolt program and something just sets off the light bulb. Like yesterday, Andy Evertson saying, I've already called our marketing company to find out how we get an ASL interpreter. So polls, we'll do a poll before lunch. And so excited to have you here today. And if we could advance the next slide, I will, let's make sure I'm not missing anything. Awesome. So Carolyn Kousky, Executive Director at the Wharton Risk Management and Decision Process Center of the University of Pennsylvania, where she also directs the Policy Incubator. Dr. Kousky's research examines multiple aspects of disaster insurance markets, disaster finance, climate risk management, approaches for increasing resilience. So she was careful to say, you know, Janiele, I'm not really in the earthquake world, but of course we all know that natural disaster work, and particularly in the area of resilience policy financing, is transferable across the disaster spectrum. I want to get right to her, so I'll just say that she has, and I'm to move my cursor here, that she has a BS in Earth Systems from Stanford University and a PhD in Public Policy from Harvard University. So many of our outstanding performers in this world come from an earth systems or a geotechnical background, and bring so much talent. So Carolyn, Kousky, welcome. And now that I see your picture, welcome. We're so happy to have you here today and look forward to hearing what you have to say. So I'm going to drop off and I'll come back in at the end. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's so wonderful to be here. I trust you can hear me okay, or someone will interrupt me. And let me just make sure, because I think I have control of the screen now. Let me see. I went too far. Okay, it's working. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Like I said, great to be joining everyone virtually. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about risk transfer and risk reduction and the link really between the two. So what I wanted to start out by saying was that I think, so we were talking about learning across disasters. I think for any kind of disaster, what's most impactful is being able to build a strong culture of risk management, which means not focusing on only one piece of that puzzle, but getting all those puzzle pieces lined up. And I tell the students in my risk management class that the kind of 3 big buckets to be thinking about when building that culture of risk management are risk communication, your education, your outreach and engagement, information sharing, the risk transfer piece, which is the insurance or the other, maybe you're putting risk in the financial markets, other forms of risk transfer, and then the risk reduction or the hazard mitigation. And I wanted to put this up at the beginning because I'm going to focus on the bottom part of that triangle and particularly try to think a little bit about the arrows between the two and how we can better build those linkages and relationships. But I wanted to put this up because, of course, we need all of this together as part of the whole. So let's move forward one. Yeah. So I wanted to start by talking about some of the challenges in disaster insurance markets, which I'm sure everyone listening, are pretty well aware of. But it's very difficult often for the private market to provide disaster insurance. And what we've seen across many types of perils and markets is that there might not be a price at which disaster insurance can be profitably offered and which insureds are willing and able to pay for coverage. And that is why you actually see a lot of quasi to fully public sector disaster insurance programs. So I want to unpack that just a little bit. There's sort of really 2 big things driving this, right? Disasters tend to be spatially correlated, right? We know this. So if I get into a car accident, it doesn't mean all my neighbors did. But when I suffer an earthquake or a flood or a hurricane, most of the members of my community probably also sustain damage, which then of course drives up losses for the insurance company. And also we know that disasters tend to be what's often referred to as fat-tailed, which just means that there's catastrophe potential. Essentially the probability of a very extreme event falls slowly relative to the severity of it. It's possible to get these very, very extreme outcomes. And that's true when we're talking about magnitudes of earthquakes or wind speed of hurricanes or any number of different types of disaster losses. So you put those 2 things together and you get loss profiles for disasters that are what I think of as spiky, right? So if you can sort of imagine plotting damages from disasters over time, you get lots of years where there's really quiet and there's, very few losses. And then all of a sudden you get huge, extraordinary losses. And that's really the challenge for disaster insurance, is that a private insurance company has to have access to enough capital to cover those huge loss years without going bankrupt. And in order to do that, right, we know they do a number of things, and the CEA does all these things, right? So you have to hold a bunch of capital, you purchase reinsurance, like insurance for insurance companies, you might be putting some risk into the financial markets. You do all those things, but those things aren't free. And you have to do those things to protect solvency, but those costs get passed on to the insured. So this is why disaster insurance is fundamentally more expensive than non-disaster insurance. And that's why you often get this breakdown in the market where you don't see folks willing to pay or even able to pay the cost of it. And that really explains why we have all these different public-private partnerships, these kind of interventions, sort of quasi to fully public disaster insurance programs. And in fact, there's very few places in the world where there's a fully private market for disaster insurance with any degree of take-up rate. But all these programs have to grapple with those same loss profiles and those same challenges, right, that private firms have to in terms of financing disaster losses. And we see also that these interventions in disaster insurance and these sort of more public sector programs for disaster insurance coverage vary a lot in how they're structured and in how they're designed. So, everyone here is familiar with the Earthquake Authority. We also have wind pools or beach plans, which are state level programs to provide wind coverage in all the hurricane prone areas of our country. We see, again, coming back to California, that the FAIR plan is starting to pick up a lot of wildfire risk, as that's sort of showing the catastrophe potential of wildfire, and we're seeing sort of drawback on the private market homeowners. We have our federal flood insurance program. So for floods, we take a national scale approach, and we have the federal government writing policies directly to homeowners. We also have a terrorism program, and I know we're focused on natural hazards, but terrorism also has that same loss profile, that same catastrophe potential. But there, instead of writing policies directly, we have a federal program that's acting as a reinsurer, as a backstop. So it's kind of a different design. And when you look internationally, you see even greater variation in the way that these programs are structured and how they're set up. The kind of one approach that's really different from how we've handled things in the US that I want to call out is that a few other countries, France, Spain, are notable examples, mandate that all natural perils be included in standard property policies. So you go to take out a homeowner's insurance and it will automatically have included in it all natural hazards. But then in order to protect companies who wouldn't want to do that because of that bankruptcy potential, right? They have the government come in and backstop losses or reinsure losses at a lower price above some high threshold. So that essentially, right, changes that actuarial assessment because you're cutting off the tail of the loss distribution. And so making it easier and cheaper for the private sector to provide that coverage. But I wanted to call that out because what we see is that in places where disaster insurance is voluntary, often there's very low take-up. So in those countries where they mandate that disasters be included in homeowners, almost everybody has disaster coverage. But we know that's not what we see when we talk about disasters in the United States, right? In California, I'm sure someone listening has the exact statistic, but I think take-up rate for residential earthquakes somewhere between 10 and 15%, right? It's the same thing when we look at flooding, right? Which is also, there's a group of people who are required by federal law to have flood insurance or required by their lenders. But when we look in general across those in high risk flood areas, we see that on average nationwide, only about 30% of those properties in high risk areas have flood insurance. Now it is higher along the coast. But it's also the case that so when we mandate things, we can often get much better take-up rate. It was kind of the point there. But that's not the whole part of the puzzle either, right? There's also some behavioral aspects to decision making. And I think you can see this if you look at earthquake take-up rate in Canada, which is kind of interesting because they have quite a difference between take-up rate, on the western side of their country from the eastern side. If you look at take-up rates for earthquake insurance in British Columbia, they're over 10% and sometimes as high as 70%. But in Quebec, they're consistently less than 5%, right? So there's more going on to people's decision to purchase insurance. And so let's look at that a little bit. We have been doing some work at sort of what the drivers are of the disaster insurance gap. So why is it that so many people at risk aren't actually purchasing disaster insurance? And there's a number of them. Let me kind of click through some here. So the first is what we just said, there's challenges with supply. The second one is a lack of information. And so this gets back to that risk communication piece that I'm not focusing a lot on today, but oftentimes people aren't aware that they're at risk or they're not aware of the full magnitude of the risk. We often do a very poor job at risk communication, in my opinion, to folks and tend to focus maybe excessively on defining high risk areas in terms of probabilities and not talking to people a lot about financial impacts or what types of costs they may sustain, and also what other sources of finances they have for their recovery, all of which is needed to make good decisions about insurance. So lack of information is one, certainly a problem. Another one that we've been doing some research on at our center is sort of insurance literacy or people's understanding of risk management and of insurance. And we find that actually insurance is a very unintuitive product for a lot of people, and it's quite unlike most things that people buy, right? It's not like other types of, it's really not like consumer goods or anything. And some folks don't understand the sort of risk management function of insurance and might think of it more like an investment or not understand the sort of value proposition of insurance. So that's certainly, if you don't understand why you would benefit from insurance, that's certainly going to drive the disaster insurance gap. Another challenge is simply risk perceptions and some of these behavioral biases. There's a very broad body of research on how we might not, how people are not very good evaluators of risks, particularly when they're low probability risks. So often very rare events or risks are dismissed and sort of basically treated like they don't exist. We also have seen a range of biases driving behavior. So things like myopia, people tend to focus very narrowly on short-time horizons. And so that can make things like mitigation that might pay off over a longer time period less attractive if the payoff period isn't sort of very quick. We see that people tend to be overly optimistic about disasters and think that disasters are things that happen to everybody else, but not them, that they are somehow uniquely safe or protected from disasters. And again, this sort of chronic dismissal of anything that seems sort of below threshold levels of concern. So low probability risks are often just not even on the decision-making agenda for a lot of people. Another driver is that sometimes disaster insurance is a poor match to people's needs. And I think we've certainly seen a lot of that when we've been looking more at the flood insurance market and some difficulties in tailoring that product to different types of flood risk and different types of financial situations for homeowners that might need sort of different types of products. And my understanding, again, folks listening can say a lot more about this, is that that was also a problem early on with earthquake insurance. When you have a really high deductible and low coverage, that's maybe not what people need and not going to be much of a value to them, which would then, of course, decrease take-up rate. And then the most kind of a fundamental one that we need to mention, of course, is simply affordability constraints. And there's a group of people who simply don't have the disposable income to cover the costs of disaster insurance. And the real challenge here is that these households are often the ones who are most in need of insurance in the first place, and they're the least able to afford it, because we know that other sources of financing are also really difficult for low-income families. They won't have enough savings to rebuild on their own. We've seen that in research at our center that they're often locked out of access to credit because they don't meet basic debt to income or credit score requirements, so they're often unable to get post-disaster financing. And there's a lot of limitations to federal disaster aid. So you might think if you don't have savings and you don't have credit, you could rely on federal assistance, but the immediate FEMA grants are actually usually only a few $1,000s. They're insufficient to bring your home back to pre-disaster conditions. And a major earthquake, in California would certainly free up other types of resources from the federal government, things like HUD's Community Development Block Grant. But we've seen across all the other major disasters that have happened in the United States that those dollars take months or more typically years before they get into the hands of impacted households. And so they're really not a substitute for having the resources to rebuild and the finances that you need in the sort of weeks to months after disaster, which is where, again, insurance can be really useful. Okay, so this was all sort of to say that there's lots of reasons that people don't purchase disaster insurance, and sort of increasing uptake of disaster insurance, unfortunately, there's not like a silver bullet. We have to address all of these things at the same time, right? Okay, let's move forward here. Okay, I wanted to come back to this issue of the move now into this issue of how insurance and mitigation are linked, right? Because another factor in insurance purchase is related to what people perceive as their individual risk, which is related to the mitigation that has or has not been done on their home. And often we're seeing anecdotally, particularly when it comes to earthquake in California, that people often view mitigation and insurance as substitutes. And in some sense, that might make sense. If you have a very limited budget, I've heard even earthquake engineers say to people, if you only have a few $1,000s, it's probably better to invest it in a retrofit and not invest it in insurance. And in a very limited sense, that's probably, probably varies case by case, but you could see why you then might think of these things as substitutes. But in many ways, I think we need to change that conversation, because mitigation and insurance, I think, are much better viewed as complements. And part of that, here we go, is that you can think of sort of insurability as a spectrum, from the easy to insure to the difficult to insure. So we were talking about all the challenges with insuring disasters, right? And that's a spectrum, from things that are a lot easier to insure, like car accidents, to things that are, impossible to insure, like global war. And natural disasters are often, for all those reasons we talked about, on the sort of more difficult end of that spectrum. But of course, when we invest in risk reduction, when we invest in risk reduction, then we can sort of push, disasters towards that easier to insure end of the spectrum, because by lowering the risk, we make it easier to provide the coverage, and we also make that coverage cheaper. And so I think having this mentality of them as complements could maybe be more useful to that culture of risk management. So what I want to turn to now is how can we do a better job of linking these two things? And I think there's really sort of two approaches here. We can think about doing this in a pre-disaster context, and we can think about doing this in a post-disaster context. So let's talk about how we can better link insurance and mitigation pre-disaster first. So the first one that's done most commonly is to simply provide premium reductions for hazard mitigation, right? The idea is that you sort of reduce the cost of insurance when you invest in mitigation for your home, and that creates a financial incentive for more mitigation. This is, absolutely important, but just a few notes of caution. We don't have actually a lot of good research on the extent to which people actually perceive premiums as measures or indicators of risk. So clearly, to some extent, they probably infer that much higher prices mean much higher risk, but sort of how nuanced that is in consumers' understanding is very unclear. And there's also no research on whether premium reductions for hazard mitigation actually incentivize new investments in mitigation or just reward people who would have done that anyway. And I think that's an important question to understand whether this is a tool that can really be used to push forward more mitigation or not. And that's a little bit unclear. But we do know that these are commonly used, at least for things like hurricane. Every state that's at risk of hurricanes has either required insurers to offer discounts associated with certain mitigation measures, or their state wind pools do offer those discounts as well. And also, like the flood program and stuff does that as well. Okay, so that's like the first simple way to connect the two. The second thing is a little bit different and one that has not been widely used. And in fact, I only know of one example, but I'm going to put it out there as another maybe cross-parallel example that might, I don't know, I'm hoping people listening can think about whether that might translate into thinking about earthquakes. But in Boulder, Colorado, the city set up a partnership with homeowners insurers. The partnership, it's called Wildfire Partners. And essentially, my understanding of it is that the community and the insurers identified important mitigation measures at both a community level and a household level. And so the community adopted these best practices for wildfire mitigation, things like building codes and things that the community had to do. And then they also identified what households need to do, right? Things like clearing defensible space and so on. And the community then sends out inspectors to households and verifies that they've done these household reductions. And when they provide that verification, then the insurers, their part of the partnership was to say, we'll continue offering insurance and at an affordable price so that you don't see, some of the like crisis dynamics we're seeing in some parts of California right now. And so that this sort of bringing insurers together with the community to identify the best practices for mitigation seems to me like maybe a plausible model to be thinking about for other hazards and in other locations as well, because we've heard talking to insurers that sometimes their understanding of mitigation might be different from what community officials are thinking. So for example, when it comes to wildfire, we've heard one big insurance company say, well, it's great that communities might have in place requirements that people clear defensible space, but we've looked at the satellite data and we know they're not enforced. So we're not going to give any premium reductions, or we don't consider that in our rating at all because we can't trust that households are actually doing it. And it's those kinds of conversations that I think then open up to identify, okay, enforcement's the issue here, and help figure out what those are. And also insurers often might have really good data on sort of which types of mitigation measures are most effective for lowering losses. So maybe that's a potential model that could be expanded. And then the third one, pre-disaster, is simple grants, right? For retrofits, which is something the CEA is doing, which is great. And other places have as well. For example, the North Carolina Wind Pool has been offering grants to some of their policyholders to fortify their roofs against hurricane winds. And I think there's, again, possible expansions of this because some of these programs have found that mitigation, at least of the riskiest properties, can sometimes pay for itself in terms of lower future claims or lower costs of reinsurance. And despite the fact that it does seem that in certain cases it is cost effective to just pay for the mitigation for people, and that can overcome a lot of barriers to people actually adopting the mitigation, I've never seen, if anyone has any examples, a private sector insurer being willing to do this. This is one of the kind of unique things of these quasi to public insurance programs that have much broader mandates, right, to also focus on loss reduction as well. So those are the three ways I think we can think about linking them pre-disaster, but then there's also some at least one way to do it post-disaster. And that's how could we maybe harness insurance to free up more funds for retrofits, so that once we have damaged, properties, can we, build back stronger and better, and use that as an opportunity to adopt the mitigation that we know would help reduce losses. And so I think there's two possible ways to do this. So one has been in more widespread use, which is simply to provide extra funds at the time of rebuilding through your insurance policy to bring your building up to code. So for example, homeowners policies have something called law and ordinance coverage, where if certain safety codes in your jurisdiction have changed over time, often existing properties get grandfathered. But if you suffer damage, then you can get the money at the time you're rebuilding to bring your building to meet those new safety standards and bring it up to code. The flood insurance program has something similar to that. If your community has adopted more stringent floodplain management regulations, then when you suffer a flood, you can get extra money so that your property comes into compliance with those. So I think that's important to bring up existing building stock that needs to be mitigated, that's not captured, when new building codes are implemented. But it also is only to code. It doesn't help you go above and beyond, which we might want to be doing in some places, because some places we know the disaster codes are not maybe at the level that we would hope they would be in terms of building as safely as we can. And so I've only seen one example of a product that provides money to go above code, but I think there's another area where maybe there's potential to do more. And that's the Flood Insurance Agency is a private flood provider, and they have a product called Flood Ready, where you can pay an extra amount each year. I think it's like $35, and then you get an extra amount of money. I think it might only be like up to $10,000, but to use that extra money to put in place flood resistant materials, or to elevate your HVAC and other types of sort of lower cost flood mitigation measures at the time of rebuilding. Now, some mitigation we know costs quite a bit more than that. So I think it would be interesting to pursue more options along this type of financing for mitigation post-disaster that would free up more money. But of course, that would mean higher premiums ahead of time. So that would be a balance that would have to be made. Okay, just one last slide. I'm checking the time, and I think we're doing okay for just a few more minutes. The last point I wanted to make was sort of, even once we figured out the financing for mitigation, we still have a whole bunch of barriers. And I know that these have been the focus of a lot of conversation. So just to kind of add to that discussion, the first one is simply awareness, as we were talking about, but not just awareness of the risk, but also awareness of the specific mitigation measures, how to invest in them, what type of benefits they have. And then related to that is that another serious barrier to mitigation is that sometimes there's very high transaction costs to actually adopting the mitigation measure. And these are things just like the cost of figuring it out for people. So, who do I call to do this? And how do I trust that they're going to do a good job? And is this a fair quote for the work? And if the person I've always used to help me with my home doesn't know how to do this, lots of times people just shrug their shoulders and don't adopt the mitigation. And so there's a lot of that kind of just figuring things out that can be hard and actually sort of present a real barrier, in the sense that people have very limited time and attention, right? People have a lot going on in their lives, and mitigation is not the only thing that they're thinking about. And so you have to kind of get their attention and make it as easy as possible for them to do this. And sometimes that means programs. There's been several examples of these that package everything together, right? Like they package the inspection, the identification of what you need, all the information, and someone to do the work, all with just one call from the homeowner. As we were talking about with disaster insurance, of course, with mitigation, cost and equity, and I know we'll talk about this more later today, are big concerns, right? And I think there's been a lot of work on more innovative financing mechanisms for disaster mitigation, and this is thinking across perils now. And that's all really important, but often I get concerned that some of those conversations miss the sort of real underlying barrier, which is actually the funding. So we don't need new novel ways to spread costs out over time. We need to actually figure out how we're going to pay back those costs and where those dollars are coming from. We've seen work at the center looked at several sort of, for example, disaster mitigation loan programs that have often failed to scale or seen very little demand. And I think part of it is that it's not the need to spread costs out over time. We have lots of ways to do that. It's that we actually need the money to pay it back and people to feel like it's worth spending the money on. And for the lowest income households, I think it's the case that we as a public sector just have to pay for those dollars for people so that they can be in safe homes as well. And then the last barrier to mitigation, just to highlight, were the ones we talked about earlier. For insurance, they apply to mitigation too, right? So all our sort of over optimism, and it's very difficult to get people's attention when there's not a disaster, when the sun's shining and everything feels safe. It's very difficult to motivate people to think about what might go wrong and to adopt those things ahead of time. And I think that, and so one, we really need to focus more on how to do that in order to motivate more preparedness ahead of time. But that's also why it's important that we also harness disaster events as opportunities to do things better. And that gets into a conversation we could have, which is a little bit different, but some of the barriers in terms of federal policy and federal dollars to actually do that kind of building differently and better work that I think needs to happen after a disaster. And I think that's it. So thank you for your time, and hopefully there's time for some questions. I'm going to see if I can see the questions myself, but also interrupt me.
So Carolyn, actually, we were going to do questions when you do the panel, if that's okay.
Oh yes, that's totally fine. Okay? Absolutely.
But I wanted to call out their outstanding questions, and essentially it's the relationship of purchase of earthquake insurance and equity, and then national disaster insurance. And so we'll let you think about those while Laurie does her presentation. Those are outstanding questions. And thank you to Christine Goulet. We've got the chat going, and it does take multitasking, but I love the vibrancy of it. So I really appreciate it. And then thank you to Cheryl Rabinovich, who's trying to cover a question on the wildfire partners. So Carolyn, thank you so much. Outstanding, and really looking forward to the panel in a few minutes, and your answer to those two questions.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm very much looking forward to it as well. And I think Wonderful. I've handed back control, right? So have I done what I need to do?
I think so. And I've got people who know more than me who will get back to you if it's not done right. So thanks again, Carolyn. And I would like to now introduce our next speaker. Laurie Schoeman is the Senior Program Director for the National Initiatives and Resilience for Enterprise Community Partners Incorporated. And I was just taking a walk around Sacramento a couple of weeks ago and walked by a new project in Sacramento with Enterprise on the banner. And this is an organization that is in communities across the nation. And what they're doing is they're attempting to preserve and protect affordable housing across the nation from the risks and impacts of natural hazards and a changing climate. And to sit down and talk to Laurie on the topic of resilience and housing is to have a discovery and educational period. Laurie, I want to not dwell on the amazing impacts that you've had in your career to give you plenty of time, but if you can touch on, I know you're going to touch on the things that Enterprise does. You came to the top of our list as a speaker for this forum because obviously residential resilience in multifamily has so many aspects that directly translate to what we're doing in single family, but also the Earthquake Brace and Bolt program has applied for BRIC and hazard mitigation grant programs to put money into grants for multifamily soft story projects. We have yet to have it accepted, but we will continue to do that because we think that particularly in that small multifamily space, that we have an opportunity to put money into those projects. So with that, I would very much like to introduce and to welcome Laurie Schoeman.
Thank you so much, Janiele.
There she is.
Can you hear me? I really love working with you guys, and it's just an honor to be able to be on this really important conversation. And always a fan of Laurie Johnson and all of the great work you guys are doing. Real quick question, folks. Should I just share my screen?
I don't know. Laurie, your slides are already up, and I've given you access to, so you should be able to just hit the arrow keys to advance your slides.
Okay, let's give this a shot. Let's see if I can. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to move this slide, but it's not moving. So if it's not allowing me to
advance them.
to advance them.
Okay, I can advance them for you as you speak. If you.
I hate to ask you. Thank you so much. And
no worries.
Great. And then we'll begin. So if you could just advance the next slide, Janiele. So it's wonderful to be with you all today. there's a lot happening in our world. The issues around housing are significant when we talk about how climate risk and climate hazards show up in the communities that many of us serve. And it'd be interesting if you could all in the chat tell us where you're from. Are you from California? Are you from New York? Where are you from? And do you work with housing? So just let's start a chat conversation to see how housing shows up for you all. Next slide, please. If you want to get in touch with me, just take a snap of the QR and you can find me and reach out for anything you need related to the conversation today. Next slide, Janiele. So Enterprise Community Partners is a national organization. We've been working for close to 40 years in and around the United States. We have 11 offices across the country. And I always say that in my role leading enterprises resiliency and climate risk reduction work around the country, I am charged with dealing with all hazards. And my role is has to encompass multiple communities from rural to urban, coastal, mountain, Gulf, island. So I really have an opportunity to really get an understanding of what's happening around the nation, in the nooks and crannies of the country, with so many different stakeholders. And it really is an honor to do this work. We develop and we deploy programs that support the preservation of housing, that support the creation of new housing. We have several divisions at Enterprise. We have a robust investment division that works on syndicating tax credits, which is the main way to fund affordable housing in the country. We're a CDFI, so we deploy funding to protect communities. We have an entire policy division that works to advocate for the communities that we serve with the eye towards building and sustaining housing. And we have a solutions division, which looks at what are the tools we need to show up with some solutions and supports for the communities that need support around their affordable housing. So my role is to try to figure out how to reduce the amount of affordable housing stock that we are losing as a result of climate change. There is a massive affordable housing crisis across the nation. Many of you experience this in your work. And at the same time, we understand that affordable housing is being subjected to incredible risk. And we're losing housing stock, which is not getting replenished fast enough. So what this does is it's eroding many of our communities that we serve and the ability for communities to deal with climate change and deal with the various risks that come forward. Next slide, Janiele. And we work with stakeholders from federal, state, local, down. We are an intermediary. We consider ourselves an intermediary, which means that we are working with a variety of partners, often translating the needs from the field of the housing development and affordable housing communities to the agencies that serve them. And so I think we play a really important role because we understand that some levers will move policy, some levers will move funding, some levers will move solutions, and we need to figure out what the levers work for the communities that we serve. So again, next slide, the climate crisis, many people call it a climate crisis. I just say that it's a changing climate, right? The climate's been changing for millennia since the beginning of time. It's only a crisis when it shows up on our doorstep. And so we know that the risks are coming at us from every single direction. COVID was another wake-up call that has not let us rest yet. We're now in our second wave of the phase, which really hit home the importance of home. We had millions and millions of Americans sheltering in place in their home throughout the last year. It is very prescient that the CDC actually got involved in the business of preventing evictions. Why? They realize that once a person is out of their home or on the street or displaced, it becomes a public health hazard. And once a person is on the street, that also becomes another vector for virus transmission. So the CDC went ahead and initiated a national anti-eviction moratorium. And people are still sheltering in place. And we understand now, and it's bolstered by the CDC, that housing is actually a medical good. It's a necessity. It's a health benefit, Many of us in the world of affordable housing have been saying that housing is a vaccine for a good life. It's a vaccine for good health. But we're being hit from so many angles by climate change. The condition in many communities of color or frontline communities, which are basically considered communities that are the first to experience climate risk and take the longest to recover, because often a lot of the communities that we work in or that many of you serve are communities that have been dealing with generations of shock, whether it's redlining, whether it's the removal of housing and the replacement with a highway, whether it is a legacy of deed restriction and disinvestment. So many communities across the nation are already in a vulnerable place. So when the storm comes or the fire shows up, they are in less of a position to recover, adapt, and bounce back, which leaves us with a great challenge. And the challenge is being taken on by our new leadership through a series of important and critical policies and executive orders that are shining a light on the very frontline communities that need the light to be shown on them. Through the executive order on adaptation, as well as Justice 40, we are now finally seeing some resource being put forward into our communities so that we can ensure that we will be able to adapt to and mitigate climate risk. Next slide, Janelle. Next slide, I'm sorry, Jasmine. So the issues are beyond just the social dislocation that climate causes. This is a material concern for the investment community. So I'm going to say a couple of things about how the affordable housing community is dealing with climate risk and how it's showing up in the material ways that we pay attention to in terms of our investors, our regulators, and the financial markets. Global warming is causing frequent and severe weather storms, and my colleague Carolyn did a great job of sort of laying out the framework of what's at stake, what is happening in the insurance markets, and how do we need to be dealing with this from the insurance and mitigation angle. This is a bigger question for us in terms of how global warming and sea level rise is showing up in real estate. Tens of billions of dollars are being spent on disasters, and the costs are growing year after year. By 2020 alone, the US has experienced $22 billion disaster events. There were 13 storms, 7 tropical cyclones, 1 drought, and wildfire events that caused close to $95 billion of losses across the nation. A $1 billion event right now is cheap. It's a matter of course. Every single time there's an event, it's costing us tens of billions of dollars. Hurricane Ida, which just struck our shores here in New York 2 weeks ago, cost an estimate of $93 billion, according to CoreLogic. And we know that the more concentrated the community, the higher the cost. So as communities migrate to cities and to urban zones, as metropolitan regions get larger, this also creates more risk for those communities. So in the great migration from rural to urban, we also saw a great evolution of risk. And this risk has now is now showing up in cities and really undermining the economic machinery that forms and generates our national GDP. So this is a really critical issue that we need to deal with as a marketplace. Next slide. And one of the interesting things that I think we should be paying attention to is, as you know, and Carolyn did a great job of talking about this, the insurance industry. And we call this in the affordable housing world or the real estate community, a material risk, right? What I am seeing throughout our development partners across the nation is the cost of insurance per unit for these risks are enormous and are preventing us from actually building affordable housing. I may have to switch over to, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the material costs of climate change are showing up in a critical way. And so the insurance piece is a problem, because what's happening is we can't build affordable housing at the rates that we've been building and charge the rents we're charging with the additional cost of insurance. And we're also seeing that property insurance is expected to rise by 25%
over the next 10 years. This is a significant hit to our bottom line. And as you all know, affordable housing, the margins of development are extremely thin. So it's not really something that we can pass through to our tenants. And at the same time, our regulators are not adjusting poverty levels and income levels and subsidies along with the rising rate of insurance. So we have a disconnect here, and this is a big problem for us. There is growing evidence that the climate change piece is also going to move some insurance markets away from certain high-risk locations, which is really problematic. The FIO said that the insurance industry cost escalation, along with the insurance industry pulling out of some markets, is going to be a major material disruption for the industry. And so this is something that we all are trying to understand how to deal with. And it's certainly showing up from the investors asking questions, and it's showing up in terms of how we develop our ESG strategies, or how we understand how to de-risk our issues. And if anyone was listening to the SEC a couple weeks ago, the issue of climate disclosure is coming forward, and having a climate disclosure plan for the real estate industry. This is a material risk that we need to deal with. So how do we deal with this? Next slide. This risk is also, recognized by the Biden administration, that we need to ensure that we have sufficient funding and policies in place to support adaptation and mitigation. We believe that with the increased effort around adaptation as well as mitigation, we will reduce our exposure, and therefore that will translate into a reduction in insurance costs, which would be the holy grail. But we haven't gotten there yet. This is where we need to be if we are to survive the next 100 years of climate change. We need to understand how we will be insuring our risks as well as reducing our risk. Next slide, please. And so what we in the real estate industry are thinking about, how are we going to move our community, our market, to come to the table and really figure out how to solve for these problems. So we've got a lot of drivers right now in front of us that are asking us to respond to climate change and understand how we're going to map out our de-risking strategy. So the big question is, how are investors dealing with this? And we're getting a lot of questions by investors. How are we dealing with flooding, earthquakes, fire? How are we de-risking our portfolios? And the answer can't just be, well, we've got insurance for everything. That's not going to be the answer. The answer has to be much more comprehensive and much more holistic as we think about de-risking. Again, rising insurance rates are a big driver to figure out how to reduce risk. And again, if this can get translated into an insurance rebate or reduction, we'd be in a much better position. Cost escalation for materials and labor are a big driver of change that's occurring as a result of climate change. Displacement of households, impacts to local economy and services, lowered property values, and regulatory changes are all coming at us, and are all levers that we need to be paying attention to as we think about reducing our risk to climate. It's a question not of if, it's a question of when. For many of us, the time is now to think about what our strategy will be to de-risk our exposure. Next slide. And so Enterprise is thinking about this in a couple different ways. And I wanted to share this with you all as you think in your communities about how you're approaching this issue of de-risking climate risk in your portfolio or in your projects. So we're thinking about this in 4 ways, right? We're thinking about how to improve the housing stock to ensure that the housing sector is building new and safer. So this is where codes come into place and technical guidance. What do we mean by a standard that will be able to motivate resiliency in a particular housing project or a site? Then we're thinking about how do we rebuild in a way that's going to be able to create more resiliency in the next event. So in California, many communities have experienced repeated loss. And please put in the chat if you are one of those communities or if you have experienced repeated loss. When we have a terrible event where housing is lost, we have an opportunity to rebuild better. Often, however, there's no roadmap for the community to rebuild better. Code doesn't always help us get where we need to be in terms of a resilient outcome. Code is meant for safety and health, yes, but it doesn't always evolve along with climate risks that are occurring with rapidity. So rebuilding is critical as we think about building our housing stock in a way that will be able to bolster resiliency in the next phase. How can we innovate? Enterprise is thinking about how do we innovate change in the affordable housing sector. So what do I mean by innovation? Innovation is really thinking outside the box, thinking about solving problems differently than we've been solving those problems, taking a new approach, being creative, asking new stakeholders, how do we build better? One innovative way to approach building is to ask builders and contractors, how would you approach certain ways of rebuilding? Or asking elders in a community, how would you innovate change in your building stock? One of the areas we've looked at is how do we rebuild housing after an event that can be a permanent solution to an affordable housing crisis that's plaguing so many communities. And so innovation is really critical in R&D. And then finally, advocacy. We spend a great deal of time advocating for the protection of affordable housing, for policies and programs that will support our communities, and to make sure that we've got our eye on policy at all times, because policy can move mountains. Next slide. And this just gives you a sense of how we're approaching this work. So a lot of my time has spent building tools, building supports for communities to articulate what we mean by resiliency. And this is really important because we don't necessarily fully agree upon the definitions of resiliency or what does de-risking mean. So what we've done is taken the steps to create guidance that will help us understand what do we mean by multifamily resilience. Multifamily resiliency, and many renters live in multifamily homes, multifamily buildings, does not mean lifting or elevating that building. I challenge all of you on this call to make sense of raising or elevating a 300-unit public housing facility. It doesn't make financial sense, it doesn't make sense technically, and it's almost impossible to do. So what are the other strategies? So we've got a book on that. Other strategies look at how do we deal with single family housing? How do we build housing that's resilient from scratch? So we built a book on that. How do we build a resilient community hub? What does it mean to have a connected hub in the community to help support resiliency? We've got a book on that. And so we're trying to make sure that we have programs to support resiliency in communities. Next slide. And it's not something that many of us as homeowners, renters, regulators are trained in, right? I'm an urban planner. I'm not an architect. I'm not an engineer. Many homeowners aren't either. So what we've tried to do, and what I ask you all to do, is really break down the steps to resiliency and climate risk reduction in a way that the average person can understand. Because who's making decisions about home and design and rebuilding? It's the person in that home. So it's important that we don't just relegate this to the professional, but that lay persons, that the homeowners and renters have a sense of what they need to do to incorporate resiliency into their built environment. And it's also important for agencies and regulators to understand this as well. When you are funding a $100 million generator program for the Department of Energy, you should know the kinds of generators that are out there, right? That's helpful, and it gets us all on the same page. Next slide. One of the big questions that's come up is, how do we understand what our climate risk is? And so we built a tool called Portfolio Protect. It's an app. It's a tool that if you key in your address, it comes up with a risk rating score of 0 to 95. This is an effort to help us understand what do we mean by climate risk and vulnerable housing. The unique thing about this tool is the way we define risk is how we measure social vulnerability as defined by the CDC, matched with climate risk and climate risk exposure like flooding and fires. And we do this, and we've created this algorithm because we understand that some communities are not are more vulnerable than others because they have infrastructure that hasn't been repaired in the community. And I'll just tell you from personal experience in Ida, a lot of our communities that got really hit during Hurricane Ida here in New York City were communities that had sewer systems that were antiquated and not maintained, right? So the vulnerability of a community is informed both by the vulnerability of the infrastructure, of the service delivery, plussed up by the climate risk. So it's important for us to understand that. I work across the country with communities that have experienced significant redlining, which has put many communities at great risk for climate change. And I'll tell you, if you look at redlining maps, and this could be an interesting effort we invest in, if you look at redlining maps across the country, you'll see the perfect match and connection between the exposure to heat, island, and flooding for those communities. And if anyone is interested in what redlining is, it's an important policy that you need to understand, which has informed the shape of many communities of color across the country that were intentionally divested in by banks and investors for many years. So the climate risk portfolio tool is important for you to understand and use. Next slide. And there's programs like Keep Safe Miami, which is a program that was created to help multifamily housing owners in Miami Beach, Miami, and Miami-Dade understand their risk to climate and to help them create actionable strategies to address it. And there's money for these owners to retrofit. Next slide. And there's another program that I want to share with you all today, which is on a program we've built to try to figure out how to deliver information and technical know-how to Californians on the front lines of disaster, to make sure that in the spirit of communication and engagement and in the spirit of demystifying a lot of public policy and programs, we can communicate this to communities so they can be stronger and tooled to be able to make change. Next slide. Hurricane Ida was just yet another reminder for us that we need to be thinking outside the box. One of the things that Hurricane Ida has done to us and has really opened up a huge Pandora's box is Ida hit communities and houses that were not specifically in the floodplain. It was a rain event. So we've had dozens of owners that I know I've spoken to in the last couple of weeks that did not have flood insurance because they weren't in the floodplain, yet they were flooded. And significant and fatal, catastrophic flooding in many respects. We lost dozens of renters that perished in this event. And it calls us to action again to say, what are we going to do about de-risking for unmapped hazards like precipitation? Next slide. And so I promised you I would share some ideas about how we can leverage financial tools for pre-disaster and post-disaster, and we can talk about this for weeks. But I wanted to share that, what we need to be thinking about right now is our pre-disaster mitigation and adaptation, because it costs us exponentially more in financial and social and economic losses once there is an event. We still have communities to this day that after Katrina have not been rebuilt. So we need to double down on what we mean by pre-disaster supports. And there are some good resources out there for pre-disaster. FEMA has the BRIC program. There is the Hazard Grant Mitigation program. These are all available to states. Cities have to apply through to the states. It gets advanced to FEMA. So there are some nuances that we need to know about with all of these programs, but there's some good programs out there, and the HUD programs are a stable set of programs. USDA has some excellent programs. And then there's some private investment that needs to be leveraged for this work. We need pre-development funding. We need what we call walking around money for some of the work that needs to be done in housing and risk mitigation. And some of that money can be found in a couple interesting spaces. I'm very interested in what's happening with ESG investment and enterprises looking at trying to figure out how can ESG or environmental social governance impact investing help this space to bring in additional funding to support affordable housing and de-risking. And there is a tremendous amount of opportunity in that lane. There's also opportunity zone funds, which have been used by some communities, underused by others, and they are contested, but that's a good source of funding. The Community Reinvestment Act is shifting to pay more attention to climate risk. So the Federal Reserve has issued a new guidance on CRA compliance, and this is an important consideration because CRA is what ultimately funds a lot of the CDFIs. And as I mentioned, enterprises as CDFI, this is good. This is support that can go into communities, and now we can spend it on climate risk reduction. So this is an important consideration. If anyone has any other ideas, please share them in the chat. The importance of the cap and trade program in California, the ASIC program, which Enterprise administers, is really important. It is a program that has been widely successful at getting funding into the affordable housing community to deal with certain issues. And California's focus on climate risk reduction is important in this program. There's also bonds that are being put forward by communities to deal with risk. So there's a wide variety of pre-disaster options and tools that we can look at to support our programs. What we need from all of you is ideas and pipeline. We need ideas on how we can leverage this funding and pipeline, which is projects that can be stood up, that are shovel ready, that could get investment. The big source of funding coming forward in the next couple of months will be, of course, reconciliation dollars that come forward to HUD and the other agencies to support housing. And HUD is standing up a robust resiliency program for housing. So if anyone's interested in that, please reach out to me. And there is also going to be the infrastructure program that comes forward. And this is going to provide us with the necessary supports for the ancillary infrastructure that supports housing resilience. So I'm very optimistic that we're going to have some really good resources to spend. But again, we need ideas, and we need pipeline, and we need alignment. And that's going to be critical to get this money out fast. Post-disaster, I'm not going to go into detail about these programs. These programs are critical, but they take a while to get online, and they often require matching funds and often require upfront funding, which is challenging for many communities and local jurisdictions. I want to point out I made a mistake because weatherization should have gone in the pre-disaster. Weatherization is a critical program that supports housing resiliency. It is its name, the weatherization program. This is an opportunity for us to really expand this program in DC and make sure we have more funding for weatherization and climate related issues. So I wanted to share this with you. Again, we could have a whole series of conversations around these funds, but this is critical for you to understand. Next slide, please. So what's the calculation? How are we going to get the affordable housing market or the real estate market to move forward and invest in climate resiliency and mitigation? I think certainly what CEA is doing and what the Wharton Center is doing is critical to making sure we have the tools and resources out there. I'm a huge fan of the Brace and Bolt program. It's one of my favorite programs ever. So when I talk about the calculation, I'm talking about we need carrots and we need sticks to move the industry, and the carrots are critical. The funding I just mentioned to you, they're all carrots, large and small. There's tax relief tools that can be levered by jurisdictions and states to incentivize the support for resiliency and adaptation. So this is really critical. Then there's process support that can be provided. So expediting permits, reducing permit fees, expediting processes. All of this is a critical piece of helping to incentivize the incorporation of resiliency and adaptation into a building. In San Francisco, for example, when LEED or green ratings were just coming out, we worked with the city of San Francisco, and they said, if you're going to go and build a green building, you can jump the line. And you know what? That saved a lot of time and money for owners. So things like that are very helpful. And then reduction of basis on mortgage, or discount of sorts to incentivize the action. On the sticks end, which we don't love sticks because they don't make friends, but sometimes they need to be used, especially if we are dealing with repeated loss communities, which is a community that has had defined, I think, by 3 or more losses. The amount of money that the taxpayers are spending on recovering those houses is a penalty to taxpayers. So sometimes we have to think about reducing that exposure, and that comes in the form of sticks, right? So if you're not elevating your equipment, there's a penalty or a lien. There's also an increased basis on mortgage, increased basis points, and regulatory enforcement, which no one ever likes, but sometimes it's critical when you're talking about life and death and safety of communities. So we have to adjust for the carrots and sticks in this work and figure out what makes sense. I like to lead with carrots, sticks as a last resort, but this is the kind of work we need to do together to figure out what makes sense. Next slide. And then, one of the big questions that I'll leave us with this is when we think about the return on investment into the adaptation space and into mitigation, we need to think about the benefits, the multiple benefits that will be able to come forward with the investment. So I mentioned before that there's a lot of attention on climate disclosure. Investors are asking, banks are asking, the Federal Reserve is asking, how are we dealing with climate risk? One idea I would put forward as a benefit of investing would be boosting investor confidence, boosting and satisfying investor confidence that you're de-risking and reducing your exposure. This also satisfies regulatory and agency confidence as well. Within the next 4 quarters, I will guarantee that there will be a climate disclosure policy put forward by the SEC. And that means that this is going to become not a carrot, but a stick. So we need to get ready for that. Another potential benefit is insurance premium reduction and making sure that we can get not only premium reductions, but potentially that could come in the form of reduced insurance policy. We are working with Munich Re and some insurance leaders right now and trying to figure out what this looks like. So this is exciting. Then there's the issues around income continuity. Efficiency and savings and all of the benefits and financial benefits we will get from this investment in our portfolio. And then finally, like I said, climate disclosure is a big trending issue right now. We need to be able to say, here's how we're reducing our risks. And again, it's not going to be having an entire insurance policy in place. So that's going to be key. Next slide, please. I'm not going to have enough time to go through this, but I just want to say that there are ways of reducing risk on the portfolio that we can talk about at some other time. But I want to say, I'd like us to move from this scenario, next slide, to this scenario, which is a building that has been rehabilitated and has incorporated all the best practices in climate resiliency we can find. And this is going to assure the stability of these public housing residents because this is their home and they have nowhere to go should this building fail again. Next slide. And this is our new normal now. So we thought we had it bad with the flooding and flood maps. Now we're looking at the fact that a lot of housing owners that got slammed by Hurricane Ida were impacted by a precipitation event. Many basements were filled. We lost over 100 people in basement units that were flooded. And one of the challenges we have right now, and this is something I'm going to talk to Carolyn about afterwards, is how do owners deal with precipitation risk? They can't get insurance. They're not getting flood insurance, and they don't want to spend additional monies on flood insurance. And these are not floodplain properties. So one of the questions we have is, how are we going to deal with these compounding risks that are coming at us? We're not going to be able to insure our way out of this. Next slide and final slide. Please get in touch with me if you have any questions. Just snap this photo. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm looking forward to a robust conversation.
Wow, Laurie, thank you so much. And thank you, Christine, for encouraging us to put on the chat. So I hope that Laurie Johnson and Lizzie and Carolyn had a chance to follow that, and maybe Laurie Schoeman, as in the next few minutes, you might have a chance to go back. Really incredible chatter going on, and just great ideas, and just our community, our colleagues. We're so thrilled that you're here. Laurie Johnson, would love to introduce you back again. For those of you who weren't with us yesterday, Dr. Laurie Johnson is now one of our biggest assets at the CEA, and is going to moderate our next panel. So Laurie, I'll let you take it from here and take us right into our lunch break. Thank you.
Great, thanks Janiele, and thank you Laurie and Carolyn for excellent presentations, and for all of our participants. I agree with Janiele, it's been a great chat, and I've tried to capture a lot of it and started kind of moving things around into a series of questions. But before we do that, Laurie and Carolyn are going to be joined by a third panelist, and that's Lizzie Blaisdell Collins. And for those who don't know Lizzie, she's Vice President of Engineering at Build Change, which is a social enterprise focused on with a global mission to improve or prevent housing loss caused by disasters. Lizzie got her bachelor's in civil engineering from UC Berkeley, or from Princeton, and then went on to UC Berkeley to get a master's. She worked in the private sector for a bit before joining Build Change to work on their mission in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. And now she's moved into this global oversight role for across all their engineering teams in different countries, working both pre-disaster and helping prevent damage, but then also working on big programs like they are in Haiti right now after the recent earthquake. So we wanted to go ahead and give Lizzie a chance, since we do have a good chunk of time here up until the lunch hour, to make a few brief remarks before we open up the panel discussion. So I think we have some slides from Lizzie. Lizzie, are you there?
Yep. Hello. Can you hear me?
There you are. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Great. Well, thanks so much, Laurie. I really appreciate the opportunity here to share a few thoughts before we dive into the larger conversation. It's really been interesting for me to hear everyone's presentations over the last day and a half, and also very motivating and inspiring to see so many talented and bright folks working on these incredibly challenging but also important issues. I wanted to start off today with a brief introduction to Build Change for folks that may not be familiar with our works, to provide some context on my perspective, then also talk a bit about how we see funding fitting into the larger housing resilience challenge, and then also share a few highlights from a recent cost study we did of different house retrofitting projects that we've worked on around the world. I might need someone to help me forward this slide. It doesn't seem to be working for me either. Great, thank you. Our CEO, Dr. Elizabeth Hausler, founded Build Change in 2004 as a nonprofit social enterprise. And since then, Build Change has worked as a systems change catalyst in the housing sector in 24 countries, both to mitigate risk against future hazards, so in a preventative context, but also to recover after a disaster, with the mission of preventing housing loss caused by disasters. We specifically focus on housing resilience to earthquakes and windstorms, and that's been the focus of our work. And over the last 17 years, we've helped safeguard more than $1.5 billion in housing infrastructure assets across Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Asia Pacific region. I personally, as Laurie mentioned, I personally started working with Build Change after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, and now get to work with all of our teams and our programs in Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So how do we approach this work that we do? We look at providing not just technical solutions, but also how can we transform systems for regulating, financing, building, and improving housing. Next slide, please. And so why is housing important to resiliency, or why is resilient housing important? I may be preaching to the choir here, but we look at housing as really the core of so many things. It's important for everyday lives, it's important in emergencies, and it's even important in pandemics, as we've all experienced over the last year and a half. It's a base for fulfilling basic needs. It's an opportunity for protection against hazards like earthquake, wind, fire, even break-ins, violence. It's also a facility for growth and asset development. So it's really at the center or core of a lot of people's lives in many ways. And we really view resilient housing not only as being disaster resistant and safe, but also locally appropriate, healthy, secure space. And moreover, and more importantly, it also needs to be affordable and acknowledged as a financial investment for its owners and occupants. I believe Laurie mentioned yesterday the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And within this framework, there's 17 different sustainable development goals. And all of those goals in one way, either directly or indirectly, relate to housing. I've highlighted here goal number 11, which is about sustainable cities and communities, which I think is one of the most obvious ones that relates to housing in all these different ways. Next slide, please. And so when we at Build Change have worked in all these different programs for improving the resilience of housing against disasters in different places, we've consistently found that the barriers to adoption of more resilient housing at scale fall into three main categories: people and policies, money and technology. You can see them here on this wheel. This is our theory of change. And we pose that by working to simultaneously overcome these three barriers, housing systems can be transformed in the long term to more sustainably achieve, improve more resilient housing for everyone. And we see really on the people side, the blue triangle there, wedge there, people are really driving the demand for resilient housing. Technology, the pink wedge, is really a means to supply it. And money, the green wedge there, is really the necessary link between the two. So to go back and kind of answer the question posed for this panel discussion, is money enough? Is funding enough? Essentially, the way we see it is no, funding is not enough, but it's definitely an essential and critical component to achieving safer housing for everyone. So I want to take a minute just to quickly look at the details of these different barriers. If we could go to the next slide, please. And maybe just click, there's some animations. So if you could go ahead and click. When we think about people, people have to want resilient housing. There need to be policies that are effective for it. And that we see this as the demand side. And different stakeholders have different roles in building demand, as well as enforcing policies that work. People, homeowners, home occupants, they need to be aware of the risks to them and their homes, and also the options available to them to help mitigate those risks. Governments and authorities, they need to help raise awareness, as well as help raise awareness not only on the risks, but also on the different ways that people can access resources to help themselves relieve those risks. Governments also want to commit to long-term change and define and enforce standards and make sure that policy is working for everyone, not just certain groups. And finally, funders and lenders, as the stakeholders, they need to be able to support complete funding for long-term solutions, and they need to demand resilience in the programs that they fund. On the technology side, we look at, what are the solutions being offered and how? Do we need to improve building standards? Do we need to look at design and construction practices? How can those be improved to improve resilience? Is there adequate capacity in the workforce, or is additional education and training required? And how can we leverage the most appropriate technologies to really streamline and facilitate programs at scale? Moreover, technical solutions need to be appealing to homeowners. What do people want? What will motivate them to adopt resilient improvements? What things might potentially dissuade them? That also needs to be looked at, as well as making sure that the technical solutions are locally available and cost competitive so that they can be affordable. And finally, money, simply put, if people can't afford to make their houses resilient or to do resilient improvements to their houses, they won't do it. So I want to take a closer look at the money side of this. If you could go to the next slide, please. When we look at funding for resilient housing, we see it really in 3 separate tiers. There's 3 buckets or tiers, I guess, of funding. The first being maybe the more obvious, which is the funds that are needed for the actual construction or improvements to the house, the materials and labor that are going to make it more resilient. The second tier is the program implementation, and this encompasses a few different aspects of implementing a resilient housing program. This may be technical assistance for providing homeowners with that sort of design and supervision support that they maybe couldn't otherwise afford or access. It may be quality assurance and control, which in California a lot of times comes through building departments and inspectors. There's project management oversight. And then an important part also is the communication and feedback loops. How are people becoming aware of the program, and what grievances and feedback do they have coming back into the program? The final tier of funding that we know is necessary is for systems change innovation. And I think Laurie mentioned innovation too, in terms of what one of the things that they look at doing. And here, by systems change innovation, this is really looking strategically at how the system is performing and how it can be improved. How can various stakeholders, policies, funds, and technologies be brought together in the most effective way? And making sure that there's resources there for knowledge management, sharing, connecting, and convening so that we can overall improve the outcomes. Finally, if we look at sources of funding for resilient housing, there's quite a variety. And I think Laurie did a great job of going over some of this ones specific to the US, but we see particularly for the construction and improvements, a lot of times we see sources coming from anything from grants to government subsidies to personal savings, private loans or micro loans, tax incentives, and also rebates. For the bigger picture things that maybe go across household and even at the systems level, we also see funding from government spending, from private sector investment and lending, from multilaterals, and also through philanthropy investment. So quite a variety of sources there as well. But again, money is such a key factor in overcoming the barriers to resilient housing. It's essential to have a variety of resources available. So if I want to take a quick look, like I said, to just talk really quickly about a study that we did and some of the highlights in terms of the cost of improving housing and what that means for funding and policy. So we examined over 200 different design samples from a larger sample of hundreds of housing improvement designs that we had done across a dozen different countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia Pacific region, to take a closer look at how the money was spent. One motivation for this was that we wanted to sort of debunk the idea that retrofitting was expensive and also show what other kinds of improvements and goals were achieved at the same time, to show that it actually really was a bargain. We looked at cases from both the preventative context as well as the post-disaster context. We looked at both earthquake and wind hazards. We looked at several different building types, primarily masonry and timber. And we also looked across several different performance goals. And we broke down the scope of work into kind of 4 different categories. Structural condition repairs. So this is items that were damaged and needed repair or replacement in the house. This could be damage due to past events like earthquake and windstorms, or maybe due just to deterioration over time, insects, rot, that type of thing. We also looked at the category of disaster mitigation measures. These are items that were specifically added in order to mitigate risk of the building collapsing or other life-threatening hazards in the event of an earthquake and windstorm. And we also looked at habitability improvements. And so these items were items we categorized as being required to meet basic health and safety standards or accessibility requirements. And then our final category was finishing and growth. And these are items desired by the homeowner or occupant, such as finishes, often forward-looking in the use of their house, also such as expansions or additions to the existing space. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what we found was one of the key takeaways is that when investments in housing are made, not only are the houses made more disaster resistant, but other goals are achieved. And this is a look at the average over all of our data in terms of the improvement costs and how it breaks down between those 4 categories. And what we see is that more than 40% of the construction costs were invested in items beyond the disaster mitigation measures. So this means that the condition repairs, the habitability improvements, the occupants' goals and desires were all able to be addressed, at least in part, during the resilience building improvements as well. It also kind of points to what we've found, which is the need to address these other items, these non-disaster mitigation related items, in order to build demand and acceptance for the improvements in the first place. And so the implication here is that funding allocations and incentives that are devised in order to build demand and increase resilient housing need to consider these additional costs in order to help further build demand and also uptake in the work in a lot of cases. Another finding that we had, next slide please, which is maybe not surprising, is that investing in improving housing before a disaster is less costly than doing it after a disaster. And here we have the cost comparison for post-disaster versus prevention. And you can see that in the post-disaster environment, the cost is overall higher than in the prevention context. And this is just the direct construction cost, so it doesn't necessarily account for the increase in costs that we would expect in terms of program implementation and logistics in the post-disaster environment. But you can see that even just for construction in all categories, or most categories, the post-disaster context was more expensive than the prevention context. And this is likely due to things like price increases, due to disrupted supply chains, high demand for labor and materials after a disaster, and we see that reflected here. And in particular, like is probably anticipated, the cost for structural condition repair was actually much higher, was 6 times higher in the post-disaster environment than in the preventative context. So the implications for this is that, funding for housing resilience should consider the cost-saving benefit of implementing improvements before versus after a disaster, and how much more effective and how much further money can go when you look at it before the disaster versus after. And the final takeaway here is that improving existing housing is more cost effective than building new housing. We found that the average cost across our sample set to upgrade housing was 23% of the average cost of building new for the same locations. And I think this kind of speaks to a bit of what Laurie was saying in terms of, the aging infrastructure of affordable housing and actually losing housing stock. So we need to not just let that get lost and build new, but we need to stop that and mitigate it and save it now while it's still a lot more affordable to do so. So I think, with that summarizes what I wanted to say before the panel, and just, really looking forward to discussing with everyone these topics.
Thank you, Lizzie. And thanks to Laurie and Carolyn as well for great presentations. I think we've just gotten so much, just a wealth of knowledge and ideas. And I want to present to all 3 panelists a first question with a bit of a sort of a make-believe scenario. Given your breadth of work, and Laurie and Carolyn, if you can join us back now, given your breadth of work in all these different places, different hazards, different cultures, and sort of political environments, let's imagine for a moment that, California's created an earthquake czar or czarina, and you guys have been asked to come in, and money isn't a huge object. What would you do? What would be one of the key ideas that you would bring to, from your experience, to the California earthquake resilience, and preferably, since we're concerned about houses, if not, you don't necessarily have to be limited by that, but just want to put that out there as a first thought, because you presented us with so many ideas. Anyone want to give it a shot?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can jump in with a couple ideas of, I think, what we found to be kind of universally useful strategies for building resilience against earthquakes in housing. The first one being that we found that successful sustainable housing programs are led by homeowners. So homeowners are in the driving seat. They get the funding or the grant or the incentive directly. They get to make the decisions about who they hire, exactly what work gets done, and that's sort of the most effective way also of leaving long-term change within the community. They tend to have higher homeowner satisfaction, better leverages existing resources. A lot of homeowners choose to invest their own resources to complement any grants or subsidies or other incentives they may receive. It also helps to stimulate the local economy and overall can be more cost efficient in reducing waste. So I would say, keeping in mind that these programs should be, these policies should emphasize the homeowner as the route to achieve resilience in housing. And then also looking at housing holistically. So although we want to really focus on disaster resilience, the home really has a wide variety of roles and thus value to the homeowner. And substandard housing, not just in terms of disaster resistance, but also in terms of habitability, health, and safety, that affects people's everyday lives and the quality of their life, and needs to be considered also for potential improvement to be made in conjunction with the resilience improvements.
Great point. How about Laurie or Carolyn?
I would offer, I just like to do a quick plug, Laurie, if you don't mind, for a group that I've been facilitating called Resiliency 21, which is a national group of practitioners in resiliency across the country that came together at the outset of the Biden administration to figure out what can practitioners do to inform the national resiliency strategy. And 3 things came out of that, a framework, which I'd like to share in response to your question, which was this. If California is going to be successful at mitigating risks from natural hazards, we've got to do 3 things. We've got to lead, which is we have to put the right governance in place, which would be the right step forward with having a chief resiliency officer for the state. Washington State has just done this. They've just elevated a chief resiliency officer, Marissa Aho, who's with LA. We've got to lead. We've got to follow the money. We've got to figure out where there are sums of money that the state can leverage and get creative to then deploy to cities and to the local level and accelerate this work. We don't have a lot of time to wait around for potential solutions that may never come. We need to figure out what we can do today and accelerate and use something like the Brace and Bolt program as a way to accelerate the construction of safe housing. And we need to make sure that we've got the principles in place of good governance, of acceleration of this work, and we've got to be able to make sure that there's alignment, which is the 3rd leg, alignment along multiple, among utilities, among infrastructure leads, and among agencies that are working in housing. So if there is a new project being put forward, if you're laying pipe somewhere in a community, that moment should be then aligned with another potential mitigation effort so that there's more alignment. We're not digging up the same road 20 times.
Great point. Carolyn, any thoughts?
Sure, I think I'd highlight 2 things. The first is that I think there's more that we could do from a policy perspective to harness the times when disaster risk is particularly salient for people, because it's always a really uphill battle to be trying to do mitigation or insurance purchases or anything house by house at a time when people aren't really tuned in to the risk anyway. And so I think one of those that we need to take much better advantage of, right, is when someone's moving into a new home or buying a home for the first time, because that's when they're focused on that home. And it's my understanding, I'm sure there's someone on listening who could fill in more details, but that Alameda or Berkeley for a while had a program where your transfer tax sale, right, that tax would be rebated to you if you invested in earthquake mitigation. And my understanding was that that was hugely successful, because that's a time when you're already tuned into the property and you're sort of teed up to be doing sort of repairs and changes before you move in, but that maybe they had to pull that back because there wasn't enough funding to keep paying for it. So if money wasn't an option and we could put back in place incentives like that, I think that might be useful. And then the second thing is to come back to a theme that everybody's been focused on, and Laurie and Lizzie both had really excellent points on all this, but we need to do more that's means tested in my thinking. I mean, at a federal level, almost none of our disaster mitigation or disaster aid programs are means tested in any way. And so directing resources at folks who can't afford the mitigation to make their home safer, because we know there's like a huge body of research that low-income households suffer disproportionately from disasters. And part of the reason is that they're in less safe construction to begin with. Those would be my two.
Great. And that kind of leads to my second question, which was around the theme of the meeting, equity. And I had some experience with one of the first really large housing repair programs, the Road Home in Louisiana. I was working there after Hurricane Katrina. And that first program, you know, I think so often some of these programs come out, as you said, they're not means tested, and they, from a political lens, equal is equitable. But equal isn't necessarily equitable. And in the case of the Road Home program, it was basically giving out grants based on the pre-storm value of homes. And some of those homes, especially in poorer neighborhoods, the pre-storm value was so low that with the cost inflation post-Katrina, what they were getting back was just not sufficient to build any kind of home. So, you know, essentially these people were just given checks and displaced. So there was a big lawsuit, and HUD adjusted that program. So I guess my next question is really, you know, maybe Carolyn, that's your answer, but maybe you want to say something else. So, you know, what can we do to better get at the issue of equity in how we approach resilience work from your experiences?
I know my fellow panelists are going to have a lot to say on this. I mean, I would highlight the idea of having means tested both for the purchase of insurance and for mitigation programs. But I also think we've seen now that there's a lot, and this is like not a California specific issue, but a federal issue, and that there's a lot of ways that our disaster programs are implemented and played out on the ground. And I'm sure Laurie can say more about this, but that aren't, it's not that inequity was built into the program. They weren't designed that way, but the end result is that they're inequitable. And I think we now have an administration that's trying really hard to change that. FEMA is taking a really hard look at its programs and trying to adjust some of these things. But sort of to your point, Laurie, about like the Road Home, when you're using benefit cost analysis as one of your criteria, lower valued property is always going to show up, right, as a lower valued investment. So I think there's a number of things on that front too. But I'll let Lizzie and Laurie jump in.
Laurie, I would just say it's a really important question, and I'm thinking about, you know, what's the magic bullet that will pull us out of this mess? You know, is there one thing that one button we can push that would jumpstart us and we'd be able to be in a different place? I mean, you know, we thought President Biden would come in and rescue us. Oh, I'm sorry for folks on the call that may not be a Biden fan, but many of us thought that, you know, with the change of election, we would have things would be, you know, magically different. I think that one thing that I know I've learned in the last 8 months is, you know, we follow ourselves wherever we go. And the problems that we face as a nation are with us and have been with us for a long time, and they're going to take many years and many administrations to undo. So the issues around equity are very much rooted in, you know, the racist policies that have been in place for, you know, for decades. And to undo those policies, we're going to have to make material commitments to changing the way our built environment is built and operated. And one big thing we can do is really double down on investing in communities that have been redlined, communities of color that have faced incredible injustice, that are living with sewer treatment plants and peakers and energy generation and transmission lines right within the community, we can start looking at changing that equation. And we could also start looking at, in the infrastructure package, setting aside material and real significant funds to operate and maintain the systems we build. I think that's a big step forward in terms of pushing forward equity, because at the end of the day, the word equity does not mean anything. What means something is a material difference, making a difference, building a home, building a bridge, repaving a road, planting a tree, giving someone a check, making wages livable. That is what, to me, changes the narrative. And that's what we have to do. We have to get real, and we have to have material difference and commitment to making a difference.
Thank you. Lizzie, any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's great, great responses. And I think some of our work internationally is really relevant. A lot of the homeowners that we've worked with, are more marginalized, are pouring into cities, for example, in Colombia, to the outskirts of cities, and in building housing, and in the process of becoming formalized. And there, for a lot of people, resilience isn't at the top of their mind. They're just trying to make ends meet. And so we need to find ways to make it interesting for them and to help them do it. Again, this can be through funding, but funding itself isn't enough. Going back to the topic of the talk, in some cases, people need more than funding. They need technical assistance, they need awareness, they need a spectrum of resources, and they need the funding. And so how can we shape programs to provide that? An example from Bogota, Colombia, the city there was, they had a home improvement program, but they're having a hard time building disaster risk improvements into that program. And part of the issue was that they were having homeowners choose between kitchen and bathroom, habitability improvement, or a earthquake resistant improvement. And so in the end, they were able to combine these subsidies and allow people to have both, which I think has also helped a lot with the uptake. They also have a special building department now that just caters towards people that are in this process of formalizing their homes, and they can have architectural and structural designs done for them when they agree to participate in this home improvement program. And so I think those type of assistance and outreach to those communities so that they are aware of this program is important, beyond just having the funding available. Also, looking at our program in the Philippines, we've found that a lot of homeowners use microfinance to make improvements to their homes. These are typically non-structural improvements, or improvements for more space, but not necessarily focused on disaster resilience. But these microfinance institutions have been able to find the right grant or loan amount that homeowners can afford and can pay back in a reasonable time. And they have a lot of repeat clients who have been using the system successfully. And we've been working with some of these MFI partners in order to incrementalize structural home improvements to reduce risk in typhoons and in earthquakes in these houses, so that these incremental improvements can be done in an affordable way, and they can be accessed by these networks of homeowners who are already working or in the communities where these microfinance institutions are working. And that helps make those improvements more accessible, and they're also able to receive the technical assistance through the microfinance institutions as well, to decide what work they want to do and what the potential problems they may find in their house if they don't do the work, and what benefits they could have from doing certain pieces of the work. And that's also been an interesting way to bring resilience building improvements to a broader audience, and I think a more equitable way.
It's really interesting, and that sort of want to build off of, there was a thread of discussion around just how the pandemic has shown us, you know, the importance of home in a new way, especially the idea that so many people now are working from home. So that sort of brings business as a possibility into the equation around potentially helping to make sure homes are more resilient and better, more conducive for having work settings as well as, you know, traditional home set activities going on in the home. And I was curious, we've talked about banks, we've talked about insurance, but do any of you have any other examples of where the private sector has been a more engaged in particularly in the, you know, helping with resilient housing?
Laurie, I'd like to introduce some good colleagues from the Institute for Buildings and Insurance Safety, IBTS. They've created the Fortify standard, which is a standard that was founded to help mitigate wind risk. It was founded by a consortium of insurance companies that recognize the extreme peril that wind brings and the credible loss of life and property. So they gathered together to create this program, which is a wonderful program that has the buy-in from the insurance companies. Fortify is bronze, gold, and silver. You apply it to your home and you see a direct reduction in your insurance, and you've reduced your exposure, which is a wonderful thing because, again, insurance should not be the first stop. This program is now going to be available for multifamily and commercial, and they've moved into the fire risk. So I think this is a great effort and a great partnership between the private and public sector.
Any other thoughts on that? There was some discussion early on, and coming back to Carolyn, just around insurance and also the idea of a multi-hazard nationwide policy. And I know Wharton over the years has been involved in a number of those discussions. There was some discussion about just, you know, that many people viewed that as a tax. And that was sort of what got pushed politically, was against it. I don't know if you have any other sort of feedback on that notion. Some of that may predate you in your time at Wharton, but open to any thoughts you want to add to that discussion thread.
Yeah, sure. I personally really like this sort of government approach to hazard insurance, because one thing we see that's really problematic when disaster perils are carved out of standard property policies, it's really hard on the consumer. First, like, they don't understand what coverage they do and don't have, and then it's putting all these extra costs on them because they have to figure out not just their homeowner's insurance, but all these add-ons that they need. And people just want to get one policy that covers them against the risk their home faces, right? And so I think that these approaches of mandating that all hazards be in homeowners policies, but then providing the government where actually there is the market failure, right? The kind of long tail of the loss distribution, and having the government step in there, which they do anyway, right? After, when you get a really severe event, that's when the government starts spending a ton of money. So I think there's a lot of logic to that setup. Getting there from here, I think, is really hard. And I think one of the biggest challenges is the path dependency, right? We already have so many individualized peril by peril approaches in the US. We've not been thinking about disasters in a holistic framework for the most part when it comes to insurance. And so I think, you know, if there was sort of serious consideration of how to move there, it really has to focus on what that transition looks like, because you can't just destroy this huge federal program, multiple huge federal programs and state programs with one swoop and put in something new. So what are the like baby steps that start to move in that direction? And I think that has not been well thought through or developed yet. The other challenge, which comes back to this issue of a tax, or sort of is related, is that in the other countries that have taken that approach, they also, you don't have to do it this way, but they also have an approach to disaster insurance that they call a solidarity-based approach. And the idea is more like everyone's in it together and we need this broad risk pool. And so it is true that in those countries, this government guarantee is partially funded by a set fee on everyone, and it's the same for everyone regardless of your risk. So that might feel like a tax. I think the biggest barrier to that in the US is that we want to use prices as incentives, right? And so we kind of want to be making sure that we're charging more where it's risky to be sending that incentive to the housing and mortgage markets and to discourage building in those areas. Because if you're not using prices to do that, then you really need to be using, other policy tools like building, land use regulations and stuff that so far we don't do that great of a job of in the US. So those are my kind of thoughts on that one.
Thank you. That was excellent. You gave a couple of really important things that I think haven't been talked about recently in the conversations on that, like the baby steps that are needed. There were a couple of questions, Laurie, around HUD. One was, has HUD done an inventory and risk assessment of their pool of properties, like the UC university system has done for all its properties, to prioritize retrofit work that's needed? Another one was, what are your thoughts on a concentrated effort to improve housing resilience for Section 8 renter? I'm assuming that renter inventory.
For the first question, that's a great idea, to do an inventory of all of the housing that HUD touches housing in many ways. Right. There's huge portfolio. There's public housing. There's HUD subsidized housing, multiple subsidy lines, and it's a vast level of exposure. So this is a question right now, which is, how do we assess all of HUD, like all of the housing that HUD touches? There are some interesting studies that have been done by the Furman Center out of New York to look at, for example, all the public housing that is in the floodplain, just a sliver of what the exposure is for HUD. And there's 400,000 units of housing, affordable housing, that HUD operates, or HUD actually funds, that are in the floodplain. And this is very problematic. I mean, all we have to do is sort of look at a map of what housing stock is in each community and where it lives. We've done some interesting mapping at Enterprise to look at what is our exposure. The thing that we have to keep in mind with affordable housing is it's not just HUD owned and operated, it's also what we call naturally occurring, which is where some of the Section 8 housing comes in, because a lot of the Section 8 is voucher based, right? So it's scattered. And so what we need to do, I think what's coming up for me with these two questions, these excellent questions, is we really need to figure out what the exposure is for all of our housing across the country, and figure out how much of that housing is exposed to extreme risk, and what is the slice that would be considered under market rate or affordable. This is a critical thing, because we don't know the extent of the problem until we really map it out. But we do know that in every floodplain, there's public housing and affordable housing, I mean, without a doubt. So it is a big issue. And I will say one last thing, HUD is really staffing up their capability in this. And I'm really happy to report that there's some really great folks that have just been brought into HUD that are looking closely at this and looking at investing into solutions, especially given the reconciliation dollars that are coming forward. We have an opportunity to do some really good work with HUD.
Thank you, Laurie. At this point, I'm going to bring Janiele back in because we're close to the hour. And I apologize to everybody whose questions we couldn't answer. I thought this was a great discussion, a great follow-on to the great presentations we had. So thank you all for the thought that you put into your presentations, and then also your willingness to kind of go out there on a limb a little bit in terms of thinking about the answers to these hard questions. So really appreciate it. Janiele?
Well, Laurie, thank you so much. That was really incredible. And Lizzie, Carolyn, and Laurie Schoeman, thank you very much. I would be proud to call any one of you a czar for California. Incredible discussion. Need to talk to Lizzie more about let them choose. Of course, in our program, we insist on a particular code. So I want to talk about that with you. A solidarity approach Could we do that? And then at point of sale, Carolyn, absolutely, it's what I preach, it's my mantra. But I wanted to close before lunch with, we follow ourselves wherever we go. You know, I mean, how could we say it any better? Thank you all so much. We're gonna welcome back. Catherine, maybe you can type something into the chat to let me know that you can hear me. We'll know that we're back up and running as I wait patiently for.
We can hear you.
Awesome, thank you. It feels a little bit like SETI in this system where I feel like I'm talking out into outer space, hoping someone is listening to me. When I set up this question for the poll, I was, blithely Googling questions about our low to moderate income homeowners and essentially just low to moderate income citizens in California, and shouldn't have been surprised by the answer to this particular poll. Brian, if you could put up the answers. Yeah, and I didn't fool anybody. I mean, obviously, this is just to punctuate our purpose for being here today, is to talk about just how everything is set up to disproportionately impact, particularly low-income Californians in earthquakes and low-income citizens around the world in natural disasters. And of course, the one that we're focusing on very carefully with our program is number one, which is that, according to the Center for American Progress, those living in poverty are more likely to live in neighborhoods with poor housing quality. And so as we go in and we encourage them to retrofit their houses, we recognize that there's an additional cost that is required when you're trying to nail plywood onto, let's say, water damaged or insect damaged wood, or trying to put anchor bolts into, frankly, concrete that is not in good condition. And so we're taking that into consideration, certainly with our grant numbers, and understand if people are going to have to do a little bit of rebuilding before they retrofit. So thank you all. Welcome back. Outstanding speakers and panelists and moderator this morning. And as I'd mentioned before we left, I certainly got a lot out of it, and exciting lineup for this afternoon. So if you could go to the next, there we go. So our next speaker, let me pull up my notes so that I am not rambling. Dr. Sara K. McBride is a research social scientist with USGS with 18 years of experience as a professional communicator and researcher, predominantly working for science and emergency management organizations. And as I mentioned, I had the privilege of speaking with all of our speakers about the topic, about the kinds of lessons and stories and expertise that they could bring to us, and mentioned to all of them, please bring lessons from the pandemic. And I thought that her comment just really succinctly described what we all have witnessed, which is that it let us see how fundamentally messy science is. And I think that all of us, if we were sitting around in person, and we had the privilege of sitting together at lunch today during this forum, we would have discussed just amazing topics, and we would have seen different sides to every position would have different sides, and just a dynamic conversation. And many of us scientists or taking science and translating it into practice. So Sara, we absolutely look forward to your presentation, and I welcome you. And I can't see, do we have, there she is, wonderful, welcome. And I'm gonna turn off now, and I'll be back with you to ask some questions. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Janiele. Let me just make sure I have the navigation right. Okay, there we go. I think I have it right. Sorry. Oh no, I've gone too far.
The slides look very cool, though.
A little
sneak preview.
It was a sneak preview. That really sets me off well, because I think one of the defining features of my career is failure. And I think I have learned much more from my failures than I have from any kind of success
I might have had. Just quickly, just a quick disclaimer. I'm going to be talking a little bit about research that's currently undergoing external review at journals. Some of the results are preliminary until published. And of course, the classic USGS government disclaimer there that I'll let you all read on your own for a second. Okay. So quickly, before I became a researcher, I was a practitioner for about 15 years in communication and emergency management. And I worked in a lot of different kind of interesting jobs. I worked at a broadcast news television station, worked at the crisis youth shelter for the New Zealand Blood Service. I worked at the University of Hawaii Library. I lived and worked in the Solomon Islands for a year for World Vision as a public relations and humanitarian development officer. And the role that I sort of coalesced around my research journey was the Public Education and Information Coordinator for the Canterbury Civil Defence and Emergency Management Group from 2006 to 2010 in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I also was the GeoNet Information Manager for the Kaikoura earthquake in the magnitude 7.8 Kaikoura earthquake in 2016, as well as for the Waikari White Island eruption in 2016. I've done a couple of, somewhat significant emergency responses. I worked in the Samoa tsunami in 2009. I worked a Category 5 cyclone, Tropical Cyclone Evans in Fiji in 2012, Manoa floods in Hawaii, and H1N1 flu pandemic in New Zealand, the Tongariro eruption in 2012. And I was most recently Chief of Operations for the US Geological Survey in Puerto Rico for the southwestern Puerto Rico earthquake sequence. And one of the roles that I'm sort of known for, I guess, is the Public Information Manager, second in command for the February 2011 earthquake in Christchurch. And that experience of watching a city that I had lived in for 10 years and really loved, as I did so much Christchurch, as so many of us did, had a profound impact on me. And I remember when I was working and going in the halls of the EOC, which was the art gallery at the time, people kept on saying, well, nobody told us it could happen here. Nobody said that we could have big earthquakes in Christchurch. And I kept thinking, but we did road shows, in my job for 4 years, we've done road shows and booklets and brochures and created all of this information around earthquakes and what's going on. And so my communication attempts, when you become a failed risk communicator, I felt like I had to do something. I had to understand more. So I decided to go, for my sins, to go and get a dissertation on in communication and media studies on what had happened. And I sort of started from a place of like, gosh, we created all of this information and why are people just so obstinate? Why are they not listening to us? The information we laid out was clear. It was all there. And, why are people just so stupid? Why can't they just grasp what we're trying to say to them? And at the end of my dissertation, the penny had finally dropped where I was like, my God, the reason why is because we had written these booklets and brochures and information for a 23-year-old reading level. And as I was thumbing through these booklets and doing content analysis, I realized we had created materials and information for people like ourselves who think about the world and about risk and about hazards the way that we do, not the way that we were trying to communicate with people. We had created a classic echo chamber. And that for me was when the realization hit around science and risk communication. So another thing that I found, and I hear this a lot where people kind of go, well, social science says this and social science says that. And again, as Janiele mentioned, in the pandemic, one of the things that I think is this process you go through when you're doing research. I was reading all of this communication literature and literature from emergency and disaster management and sociology and public health and anthropology and psychology and linguistics and human geography and all of these different areas. And at the end, I thought that there would be this, beautiful sort of lotus leaf of wisdom and understanding, and that they would all agree and come to this great golden chalice called consensus. And the experience was so much more like this. This is my dragon slide, where you're looking at this 7-headed hydra, where you have groups of people who do not agree fundamentally on how knowledge is even formed. So how do you come to any kind of consensus when you are looking at all of this? And quickly, I came to this, which is from Griffin's textbook from 2014 on theories of communication. If you're interested in communication research, this is a great text. And really, it maps out epistemological and theoretical perspective. So epistemology is basically how we know what we know, you know? So it maps out these territories. And what we look at is we look at the objective territory and the interpretive territory. And in the objective territory, which is mostly quantitatively focused, so around numbers, is the socio-psychological, cybernetic, which is the process of communication, semiotic, which is around symbols, phenomenological, which is around experience. So now we're in interpretive territory, critical theories, sociocultural, so that's the sociology and anthropology perspectives, and rhetorical, which is sort of known as speech communication. And for me, when I am looking at communication research, I tend towards the socio and cultural frameworks because communication to me is inherently social and cultural rather than cognitive. Now, there are cognitive aspects to communication, absolutely, and social psychologists absolutely have a place in communication research, no doubt. But for me, when I'm looking at it from that social cultural lens, and a little bit of cybernetic, looking at processes, and experiential, so phenomenological. So this is just a quick sort of tour of just the different maps in communication research alone. There's 86 prevailing theories of communication currently going on, 86 different communication theories that are prevalent in communication research currently. It's a massive discipline. And I'm just going to talk about a few of them. A heuristics processing model, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. The co-orientation model of communication, which is one of my favorites. And that's really understanding the relationship between the source of the information and the receiver of the information. Excellence theory, which is the two-way model, we often call it in communication theory. Source, message, channel, and receiver, that's the classic Berlow model, which is a semiotic model. So it just names the processes and formulates the process of communication. Participatory communication models, which is, again, we talked about a lot about yesterday, and inoculation theory, which is another theory that I sometimes use. And so the heuristic and semiotic systemic model is often framed in sort of crisis communication. And that's sort of that binary dynamic we sometimes talk about. There's logical people, and then there's emotional people. And, you know, Slovak really championed a lot of this work, but really it's not as binary as we think it is. And we tend to hold logic as the highest form of understanding. And we can, some of us, not all, and some of us view emotion as a lesser form of understanding. And yet we know in crisis, and when people are making decisions, they often go to emotion or to gut feel, or what feels right, rather than necessarily facts, numbers, figures, and information in that way. So in crisis, there's a few ways around this. One of the ways is that if you're dealing with people who are traumatized and maybe they don't have the ability really at that moment to think about things logically, and I'm not preferencing logic, I'm just using that as a framework, use spokespeople that are known to the community. One of the things I thought was brilliant really early on was in Louisiana, they had the football coach on stage with the emergency managers explaining, and public health people explaining COVID. And someone texted me and thought, this is ridiculous, Sarah. Why are they having the Louisiana, college football coach on a stage? And I thought, that's amazing. Those communication people are brilliant because they're using people that the community understands and trusts and relate to. I thought that was fantastic. And be mindful when you're sort of introducing kind of new information without some community knowledge, it may not be received well. So again, using people who understand the community and frame the community and have good relationships with the community is a really good way. And they're called trusted, credible messengers in research. And Ava Marie covered this really brilliantly yesterday, so I don't want to go over what she's already talked about. We know that numbers alone don't work. And it's not a matter of just getting numbers right and simply telling them. And I'm going to walk through some case studies where we use numbers, but we also use different persuasive methods as well to contextualize the numbers. I'm going to talk to you about a few case studies that I work with. So I work on Shake Alert, Shake Alert is the earthquake early warning system for the West Coast of the United States. It's managed by the US Geological Survey and our many partners. And it is currently active in Washington, Oregon, and California. And here is the story that I think the USGS wants to tell about Shake Alert. An earthquake starts somewhere and the Shake Alert system in California, Washington, and Oregon, and the Shake Alert system kicks into action. The first felt wave is recorded on our sensors. It goes to the Shake Alert processing center, and then the Shake Alert delivery partners connect to that processing center and are able to deliver those messages. Technical systems immediately respond when they receive a Shake Alert message. That means passenger trains are slowed, firehouse doors are opened, and announcements are over public address systems, among other technical systems. But people also receive the alerts on their phones. And here is what a wireless emergency alert for Shake Alert looks like currently. So if there is an earthquake that is large enough, magnitude 5 or above in these 3 states, you may be getting a wireless emergency alert from the Shake Alert system. And then people get this alert and then they act quickly. And they act quickly because they know what to do. So they know how to do drop, cover, and hold on, or if they are using a cane or have a walker or using wheelchairs, they know what to do. They've already drilled that. Or if they're in a car or another location, they know what they can do when they receive that message. So that's the end of our story. That's what the USGS wants to tell. People are happy when they receive the alert. Injuries and deaths are reduced. The trauma of sudden onset, strong shaking without warning is decreased. And post-alert messages are sent right away, explaining to people how the system behaved, so people are more knowledgeable about the system next time and trust is increased. But how do we get to the story? Well, we work with a lot of partners, 60 plus organizations and counting, plus an entire small army of seismologists and earthquake engineers to make all of this possible, all of our amazing technicians. It's a whole community working on Shake Alert. And we also have a smaller community within that called the Social Science Working Group. It now has 30 members across 13 universities, research institutions, and 6 countries. And we now have 17 projects. And it includes the whole ladder of researchers in the career area. So we have full professors, early career researchers, graduate and undergraduate students are all involved. And we have a wide range. So that map that I showed you at the beginning of the communication disciplines, we cover all of that. So we have anthropologists, sociologists, geographers, social psychologists, operational and decision science researchers, computer scientists, communication and media studies researchers like myself, science and education researchers, emergency management and public administration researchers are all involved. Even a seismologist got snuck on the team at the Social Science Working Group. And the research to practice looks like this. So here is an example of a tweet that was sent out. If you felt the earthquake in Southern California on Friday, the tweets and information that was sent out was informed by research. So it's already used by the Joint Committee of Communication, Education, Outreach, and Technical Engagement for Shake Alert, including on Twitter. And it also informed the development of the Shake Alert message itself. And we also have research projects on diversity, equity, inclusion. We have a self-reflective guideline and framework for operators of earthquake early warning systems, protective action guidelines, data latency research, among others. One of the key questions we wanted to know is there technological privilege? Is your smartphone going to receive a message, a wireless emergency alert faster than a less costly phone, an alternative? And what we found was a little track phone we bought 30 minutes before a wireless emergency test for $20, just down on 7-Eleven, was actually faster than many of the smartphones. So we found that actually you don't get preferential treatment based on the expense of the amount of the cost of your phone. And we also conduct a survey. We just did the baseline survey in February where we track progress over time regarding Shake Alert perceptions, attitudes, and knowledge around things like protective actions, alerting thresholds, those kinds of things for people living in the 3 Shake Alert states. So now I want to talk about statistics. Earthquake early warning in some ways is a little bit of an easier concept to talk about than aftershock forecasting. Aftershock forecasting is our statistical models that will tell us potentially what could happen, the different futures that could occur, and their probabilities after a large earthquake has happened somewhere. And this is the template that we have developed at the USGS. This is version 1. We are now heavily into developing version 2. And instead of starting with numbers, the USGS, we started out with a couple of phrases. The first 4 bullet points does not include any statistical information at all. In fact, it just starts with be ready for more earthquakes. And these are for magnitude 5 or above earthquakes where we know it's gonna be likely you're gonna experience probably more aftershocks. And where there are more earthquakes than usual called aftershocks will occur near the main shock and will continue to occur. And we go through what is likely going to happen and then what to do about it. So when you feel an earthquake, remember to drop, cover, and hold on. Because we know if we give people bad news and information that is difficult, even if it's true, you need to give them something on the other hand that they can do to improve their situation, because you want to increase positive outcome expectancy and you want to reduce fatalism. And again, Anna Marie spoke about this really well yesterday. And then we go into statistics. And so we call that the hierarchy of information. We start out very basic and then we go into complexity, and people can choose their own level of complexity that they want. And before we started with that template, we knew that, this kind of process does work based on research that was done in Canterbury, New Zealand. People like maps and narratives and tables and numbers for these statistics. And if you're including these, you're probably going to have a much better outcome with people understanding and grappling with the information that they have. And we are currently in the process of testing visualizations and maps. What we have already learned through this process and through a media analysis done on the Anchorage earthquake is that the forecast was frequently quoted in the media, even line by line, just notes were taken and put right into the media, which was different than the Bombay Beach scenario in 2016, where we did a similar media analysis. And we found that even though we had the media advisories, the media wasn't quoting as rigorously as from the Anchorage template that was used. And what we found was the forecast can be used to combat rumors using authoritative information, because you're giving people something that can help them understand what is going on. And most media express probability as a chance, and that's consistent with the USGS advisory, again, based on social science guidance on how to present probabilities. And in Puerto Rico in 2020, we did things a little bit differently. We used scenarios, which were 3 possibilities, 3 main buckets, basically, of future probabilities to explain what could happen. So we could provide further text, further contextualization, and narratives that people could understand about what could occur, rather than just presenting numbers again. So again, we're constantly iterating and learning through this process. Oh no, there we go. And it's ongoing work. Here is an example of what we did in Puerto Rico. On the upper left-hand side is the information we put out around duration. So how long people can expect to have a higher probability in Puerto Rico. And we put out all of this technical information, and at the bottom, if you note, there's a number there. And that number is a crisis mental health hotline. And people might be thinking, why are you including a crisis mental health hotline with statistical information? If you have been traumatized and you've lost your house, as is seen on the upper right-hand side, the last thing you want to hear is, hey, more earthquakes are coming. And some people will reject this information offhand. So we wanted to provide mental health resources for people who are reading this information. If they find it upsetting or troubling, they have support and they know where to go if they need extra support during this time. Now, the ongoing work is being led by my wonderful colleague, Jennifer Santos Hernandez. She is at University of Puerto Rico. She's doing a comprehensive study, which is almost near completion, regarding the aftershock forecasting and visualization, as well as wording for the current template. Her work is including focus groups in 3 communities that were impacted in the 2020 earthquake and the sequence, as well as semi-structured one-to-one interviews with leaderships at all levels of governance, and surveys with 3 impacted communities in that southwestern part. So, ultimately what we find is people are diverse and intelligent and interested in technical information, but it can really surprise you for the reasons why they're interested. And the work in New Zealand with Anne Wine leading this group, she found that people valued the forecast even if they didn't understand it. They found the science as a source of comfort. We've already had that feedback from one-to-one interviews in Puerto Rico, where one of our participants said, reading this forecast gives me hope. It makes me feel better. And we were surprised about that, but people use this for comfort. So just quickly, kind of want to leave you with a final story, which is the Bombay Beach case study that was done in 2016. I did a media analysis and social media analysis on how the earthquake advisories were received amongst the public. There was hashtag earthquake advisory, which went sort of viral and was one of the top 10 Twitter hashtags that was trending on Twitter. And at this time that I had worked on this piece, there was a lot of skepticism on social media. And I have to say, quite a lot of skepticism about social science research in general within the Earthquake Science Center. And our Earthquake Science Center director, Dr. Steve Hickman, who is a wonderful seismologist, he was pretty skeptical himself, both on social media and on my work. And he personally reviewed this paper. It took him 3 months to read it. And I had been engaging with him about social media. And I know I'm not the only one. We had many people at the USGS wanting the Earthquake Science Center or the Earthquakes group, because there's 2 science centers that are working on earthquakes, to have its own Twitter account. So I wasn't the only one doing this, but Dr. Hickman reviewed it and he came into my office later at night and he put the paper on when he was finished, put it on my desk and said, we need a Twitter account. And it wasn't just me who did this. Many people work on this account and owe credit to this, but also the research was persuasive enough for Dr. Hickman to say, okay, yes, this is a good use of our time as well. And finally, I think the many voices, including the research, finally persuaded him to do something. And sometimes what your biggest job is to do as a communicator is convince people inside your organization to back up your approaches. So again, personal stories, which is what I just did, can be engaging. So if you can tell a personal story and engage with people, that always helps. And what does work? How do we encourage people to prepare? I always think being a science friend, the relational stakeholder theories, being there, being listening, being empathetic, being compassionate. And I know it's hard, particularly in this environment, as Janiele said, the curtain has been lifted on the messiness that is the science community through this COVID process. And I think people are in shock and in awe of what this process is like. Suddenly they're looking at preprints and looking at statistical models that maybe they would never have been exposed to, and looking at thesis, antithesis arguments going back and forth in the science community. And that can be really discombobulating for some people on how to contextualize all these different arguments in science. So being a science friend, being willing to have those conversations, being willing to be open and honest about what we know and what we don't know, I think always really helps, and being compassionate and caring during this time of confusion that we all have about information. And multiple science voices are good. Local, national, and international science voices help. Maybe someone's not going to listen to someone locally for whatever reason, but they may listen to someone nationally or internationally. So having those voices always help. And that can increase positive outcome expectancy. So if you're going to tell someone some bad news, give them something meaningful to do if you can, and encourage preparedness as a community effort. Be prepared to set up the standardized templates that we had with the aftershock forecast, but then also be prepared to change and pivot and meet the needs of your community as required. So conclusion, this was me last year in the 6 months in 2020. And I think it's probably a lot of us just overwhelmed by what has happened and what is going on in the world. And it can feel very, very overwhelming. So there's just no one perfect way to encourage people to communicate with you and about a topic. I like to think about it as a recipe that is continually evolving in its ingredients and its outcomes. And you need a certain amount of flexibility to be able to make those changes and move with it. Likability and relatability are major factors for a lot of people in good communication. There's many different ways and perspectives you can communicate. Humor works great too. So don't be afraid to be a little bit funny, as long as you're not mocking other people or making them feel bad or making too light of a difficult situation. And sometimes we in our organizations can be our own worst enemies, right? We can stand in the way of communicating and batten down on our own creativity or the creativity of others because we're concerned about the risks we're taking. And look, if you're listening to this and thinking, gosh, Sara did a great job, first of all, don't. I wrote an entire dissertation about my epic failures with communication, and I fail at communicating all the time. You are not alone if you have felt the failure and the sting of a message not landing, or a talk not going well, or a campaign not being as successful. These are hard, difficult problems. We have literature that spans decades still trying to unpack the human condition when it comes to communication. And so you're not alone. I'm happy to share with you any articles I mentioned here. I didn't want to go through a whole big reference list, but I do have one. And if you want any articles that I've written, all my articles should be open access, but you can always reach out to me as well. Here are my details. You can reach out to me on Twitter at disastrous.comms, or you can follow me, or you can email me at my email at usgs.gov. Anyway, that's it for me. Thank you.
Sara, thank you. That was excellent, and I'm loving this picture of this cat. But I have a story for you. So a good friend of mine, we go up to Tahoe with a bunch of girlfriends, and she tells me that there's a part of the Truckee River that runs uphill. And so the next day at breakfast, I got all my physics lessons. I got drawings and sketches and elevations to explain that basically there's an area where it wants to run uphill that's what's called a lake, and that it can be propelled uphill and all this. And at the end of it, she says to me, well, those are some very interesting ideas. And so let's just say I failed. And it is surprising to those of us that live in the dweeb world when you feel you've made this compelling argument for something. And if there's anything I've learned in the last 15 months is that there are going to be arguments that I could never, ever have thought of. And so the denier, the disaster denier, is there a chance? A person who is just so dug in, or do we just continue, as you said, to continually bring thoughtful, the spectrum of communication to them?
I mean, I think there is always hope for people changing their perspectives, but I think it comes from relationships, right? None of us want to admit we were wrong, except for me. I love admitting when I'm wrong and I fail, because failure is just such a great learning moment, right? And maybe many of us feel comfortable admitting that we failed, and maybe I'm not the only one. I mean, I don't think I am, but I think it's making sure that people have a safe space and they feel safe with you to be able to ask questions and feel like no one wants to feel that they're wrong and that they're an idiot, right? Yeah. And that they're being mocked and looked down upon and belittled. And I think we have to be very careful that we don't do that to people, and we keep relationships and communication open. And there is a point too where you have someone, and some of us have this in our personal lives, or they have this in our professional lives, where dialogue is no longer going to work. And maybe you just need to take a step away, and maybe you're not the person to deliver that message. Maybe someone else is required to deliver that message, and that's okay. There have been times in my career where, for whatever reason, my gender, my age, I was not the right person to deliver a message. And so I got someone else who maybe fit more comfortably with the demographic of authority that people wanted to hear deliver a message. So sometimes you're not the credible messenger. And you can, sometimes you're the bride and sometimes you're the bridesmaid. And if you're the bridesmaid, take that role with love and respect and do it the best you can. Maybe your friend was just not willing to hear the information you were ready. Maybe there was somebody else she wanted to hear it from.
Exactly. Well, I was willing to pay for a float ride down the Truckee and show that there wasn't a single moment when we went backwards. Well, thank you so very much. This was fantastic, and you will forever be in our group of wise people that we'll call on from time to time. And we really appreciate your participation today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. So on we go to a panel that is another exciting opportunity to hear from some tremendous people. So our panel is absolutely directed at people who are out in the community with programs looking to create smarter homes, more resilient homes. And I want them to tell you their stories because they're really fantastic. But let me introduce Julie Shiyou-Woodard, President and Chief Executive Officer at Smart Home America. And she oversees operations, provides organizational direction, and develops partnerships for a national not-for-profit whose mission is to build resilient and sustainable communities. And then Thomas Corley is the Chief Recovery Officer at St. Bernard Projects. And I don't know if there's an S on the end of that. Thomas, I'll let you correct me. With experience in working in disaster recovery industry, with strong business development, professional skills. This is an organization that I hope, Thomas, you can give us a little bit about the two people who started this, who went down after Hurricane Katrina to do some work on recovery and have been there ever since, and who, as I understand it now, are of course dealing in the aftermath of yet another hurricane. So I could welcome Julie and Thomas to turn on your cameras. I can't see whether you've done that. There they are. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And Thomas, I understand you are safely in, is it California?
No, I am actually in Lake Charles today, and then out to kind of the greater New Orleans area tomorrow to survey our Ida response work.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and Julie, you're in Alabama.
Actually, today I'm in a hotel room in Oxford, Mississippi, but yes, I am normally in Alabama. So.
Okay, I just wanted to mention you too, that is closer to the hurricane area.
Yeah.
Which is a joke, obviously, because you're both so involved. So Julie, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about your organization, yourself, and the mission, and then we'll let Thomas, and then would love to get some questions to you.
So the cool part about this, and Thomas, I'm so glad you're on here with me, is it's so good to see you. So we basically,
Julie, you have slides. I'm sorry.
I do have slides, but I will just say that both SVP and Smart Home were birthed out of Katrina. And Thomas will give you the cool background there. Our organization came out of basically a group of thought leaders that really just said, okay, what we just did, and they were speaking to Hurricane Ivan, because we were building back, and 11 months later, we experienced Katrina. And this was so funny because I was just telling my team, I was like, oh my God, of all of the people that have spoke on this, everybody's covered like the normal slide deck I would do, which takes an hour, starting with Laurie Johnson yesterday. Like half of my slide deck was like covered by like everybody. Now, I mean, today I only have like 12 slides, but even Anna Maria was talking to the stuff that we talk about. And Anna Maria was talking about what we call the traditional paradigm. You build it, it gets blown down, you build it back, it burns down, you build it back. And it's the same way all the time. And after Ivan and Katrina, there was a group of thought leaders, insurance, code officials, elected officials that said, okay, that didn't work. It's not worked and it didn't work. Let's do something different. And they reached out and looked for what was different. And 11 years ago, what was different and was sort of hot off the presses was the fortified standard, which Carolyn talked about and Laurie Schoeman talked about. And so a lot of stuff that I'm going to say today is going to like wrap up, I think, hopefully what so many of the speakers have spoken about since noon Central Time yesterday. And SVP very much is involved in the way that this construction method is utilized and we'll have, because I don't know, Thomas, if you've got visuals yet, but we'll have amazing visuals to show that building resilient and above code really does work. And so we're just a nonprofit that is, our job is to do what I'm doing, is to share this information with you and to try and help you figure out how to integrate it into what you're doing. And we work very much at the local, state, and federal, not so much. We partner a lot with everybody that works at the federal because we just don't have capacity for that. So SVP does a lot of work at the federal level. And so we work closely with IBHS, which was mentioned today. So a lot of what we do is sort of grassroots and grass tops. So we're looking to integrate a better way of building so that homeowners don't know it's happening, but it's happening, kind of thing. And policymakers kind of don't know it's happening, but it's happening. So then resiliency is just there but it touches everything that everybody's been talking about. So I'm going to be quiet and let Thomas tell about SVP.
Thanks, Julie, and excited to be here. So in many ways, SBP looks to Smart Home America as kind of the beacon of light and the guidepost for how we should mature and evolve our own thinking. But to bring it back to the start, our organization, SBP, started right after Hurricane Katrina. Our co-founders, Zach and Liz, were living in DC at the time. Zach, a public defender, Liz in education, saw the effects of Katrina on New Orleans and outlying parishes and felt compelled to do something. And so they did what they thought was right, which is pack up their stuff, head down to New Orleans with the expectation that they'd be able to provide some rebuilding support. And what they found when they got to New Orleans is a myriad of disorganized, siloed, and really ineffective response models that ultimately left thousands of homeowners and residents without a clear path to recovery. And so after spending just a short period of time kind of camping down there and supporting feeding operations, Zach and Liz decided to uproot their life, go down, become residents of St. Bernard Parish, and establish a rebuilding effort. And in those early years, what we defined as really effective and appropriate rebuilding was kind of small. Like, we aimed to put back together bedrooms and kitchens and living rooms, really undoing what Katrina did to provide a level of security and safety to families. And then we grew. And so we grew out of St. Bernard Parish into Orleans Parish, and we grew out of Louisiana to Missouri to where we stand today, which is with 10 independent rebuild operations as far as the Bahamas to Houston. And for a long time, we did the same thing. We believed that the right way to intervene and to help heal was to restore properties to where they were pre-storm. We had kind of that nonprofit mentality of, we've got to stretch every dollar and we have to impact as many individuals as possible. And frankly, I don't think we saw the full picture, and I don't think we looked far enough out into the ripple effect. And if we were providing a Band-Aid, or if we were fundamentally changing the trajectory and the healing process for individuals that are affected by natural disasters. And so, about 4 years ago, at the council of our board, and after seeing organizations like Smart Home America and being introduced to IBHS and understanding kind of the basics of Fortified, we decided that if we were going to be true to our mission of shrinking the time between disaster and recovery, and if we were to truly obfuscate the need for organizations like ours, we had to build things back better than they were. And so about 4 years ago, with some great funding through Travelers and a number of partners, we incorporated the Fortified standard. And today, what's exciting is that we're seeing that implementation and a number of our operations. So I'm in Southwest Louisiana at our Lake Charles operation today. Every roof that we're rebuilding here after Laura and Delta is done to the Fortified standard. Just 4 hours away in New Orleans, every roof that we're doing is built to the Fortified standard. And we can, to Julie's point, we're gonna be able to show the homes that withstood Ida, that will not need a roof, that will not need interior repairs because of that Fortified build. And those that we rebuilt 8 years ago, 9 years ago, that weren't to the Fortified standard. And we're running a program in South Carolina where we compelled the local government to not just require us to build to code, but argued that we must build to the Fortified standard. So every roof we do through this government program will be built to Fortified. And I think I got my start at SBP 10 years ago doing case management in New Orleans. And so for me, everything orbits around the homeowner and the homeowner experience. But what we've learned is that the healing process for a homeowner, or for an individual that has been affected by a storm, can only go so far if the fear of the next one is keeping you up at night, right? Like, and we know with global warming, we know with the intensity and the wetness and the length of these storms, that anyone living in our service area knows that at some point, whether it's in Lake Charles, it happened in just 6 weeks from one another. But in many of our communities, the residents, the homeowners, they know that another one is coming. And so if we're able to provide them not only with that physical, structural security by building to this code plus, to this fortified standard, but also that psychological safety, knowing that their home is better and stronger than it was pre-storm, that's when real healing begins. And that's when organizations like ours can move on from leveraging volunteers and great donors to rebuild homes, to doing the work that matters, which is what Julie alluded to, which is really arguing for policy change and code change so that we see structures built in a way that can withstand storms. I'm happy to take questions along the way. I know Julie's got some thoughts to share, but again, just excited to be a part of this panel.
Yeah, Julie.
So I am going to use a little bit of the slide deck because we finally got approval today to show an IDA side by side, and I will get to that if my slide deck works. So we'll see if I can advance. Maybe not.
We can always ask Erin to advance the slides.
I clicked my screen, Erin. Okay, there we go. So that's everybody, you know, Smart Home America, people think we're like the Internet of Things or like the wiring, and I inherited that name from the board. So our thing is that if a home cannot take the wind and the water and it doesn't have insurance around it, and it's not energy efficient, then that homeowners and those families, and especially our marginalized communities, right, they can't, that's not a forever home. And it's not a legacy that's passed on to the generations because they can't afford to be there. So we always argue that it's got to be a home that can take the weather and it can recover because there's insurance and its longevity is there because of energy efficiency. And then like after all of that, if you want to get Alexa to open the door for you, that's great. So we're going to come back to all this stuff. So we have like everybody since 12 o'clock noon Central Time yesterday has talked about the circle, right? Like everything that affects a community. If your community doesn't come back after a major earthquake or flood or tsunami or wildfire, then you don't have a tax base, you don't recover. And so all the different pieces and parts of that, and everything's affected by that, right? The way that we use our money to recover. I forget if it was Laurie or Lizzie or somebody talked about building codes. Really where we saw a shift in the way that things were happening in the Gulf of Mexico states where hurricane is the highest risk at the coastal level was that Harvey was a great test case for us in that we could see the continuum of building codes. So building codes do work, but they are just life safety, right? They have nothing to do with the structure surviving and all your content surviving. We also know that 2/3 of the homes in the United States are underinsured if they're insured at all. And so if you're an LMI community, that's an even worse scenario there. So if you're underinsured by an average of 17%, let's just go with a $200,000 home, right? That means you don't have $34,000. That's like, you don't have $34,000 in your bank account that you don't know that you need in order to truly recover because your insurance is not going to cover your whole thing. Everybody's talked about this too. That's even worse when it comes to a marginalized family. Small businesses, it's even worse, right? That statistic that 1 in 4 don't open after a major disaster, that number goes up as the years go on. Somebody said today an average of 6 years for that federal dollar to get to the ground. Harvey is still waiting. Harvey affected areas. Katrina, I think Laurie Schoeman said today, I mean, I'm born and raised in Mississippi. When I'm traveling around talking, people will say, oh, I drove down the Mississippi Gulf Coast and it was just so beautiful seeing all that green space. And I get real serious and I go, those were big antebellum houses. We didn't have open space on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. We didn't have green space. We had entire communities. We just don't have communities back since 2005. So, you know, we still in Mississippi haven't recovered either. So I'm going to tell you real quick, and this is what SVP is doing every day now. So we shifted the paradigm. So there's 20 years of science behind the way the fortified method is done. It's been proven across every university that's got a test lab. It's been proven from all of the national building science laboratories. Like, we just know how to build a house and the system of that house to work. And so it has completely shifted the way that we recover, and we needed something to test it, and that was Hurricane Sally. There were over 17,000 structures in the path of Sally, and the key to Sally was that it moved at 2 to 4 miles per hour, which was painfully slow. So we had 17,000 structures that sat in the eye wall for 8 hours. So it was a very long beating of those structures. We're still waiting on IBHS to crunch all the data. And this, I think, I got really excited when everybody was talking since yesterday about the fact that insurance is not always realistic for a low to moderate income family, and it may never be. And it may be 1 year, but there may be a crisis, and it may take their income away from putting it into insurance when they have insurance. So we know right now that when all of the numbers are crunched, that hopefully it's going to stand, that 95% of those 17,000 structures didn't make a claim. So that means that they were in a structure that took 8 hours of an eye wall and did not have to make an insurance claim. So the more I thought about everything that was being shared over the last day and a half, I thought, oh my gosh, there's this whole other thought process behind the way that we're constructing that I didn't even think about until I was listening to everybody sort of say the same thing in a different way over and over, is that if you can't afford insurance, but you're living in a house that's built to take the hazards in your area, then you should be able to get through whatever that hazard is and not be financially ruined. And so, I don't know, I was just thinking that was a lot of the stuff that was running through my head the last day and a half. So and fortified's affordable, because somebody talked about like 25% of something on a structure increasing that cost. I don't know if that was the deferred maintenance and energy efficiency and mitigation all going into an existing. I think that may have been from today. I was actually driving during some of the early presentations, so I was trying to write on a note card. But I can tell you that there's only a 1 to 3% increase in construction costs when you're building something new, and there's only a 1 to about 5% increase when you're retrofitting an existing structure. And Thomas can speak to that much more than I can. But this next slide, these are habitat homes. Those little like rectangles in the middle there. This is post Hurricane Michael, which was a Cat 5. And these houses, which are completely affordable, were built to the Habitat Strong level, which is fortified. And so that family is coming back to a house that they can move into. No, they're not going to have power. They're not going to have water for a while because that was a severe event. But they are going to be able to get back in their house and start recovering. And so if you're thinking about financially challenged areas of communities, if they're built to the hazards that are there, and we know emphatically, and Thomas can speak to this, we know it can be done affordably. We've been doing it for the last 6 years in 9 markets. It can be done affordably. So that home is now more resilient. This is right there. All that stuff at the curb, like those houses are fine, the walls are still there, but the #1 loss in the United States from an insurance perspective, when they write a check out to policyholders, and this is even with wildfires, the #1 loss that they write out every single year is water intrusion through the roof in homes across the entire United States. Fortified eliminates that loss, eliminates those families being displaced and all their stuff being at the curb. And the good news, because we talked about this, we can actually eliminate the damages from EF0s, 1 and low-level tornadoes. So we can't eliminate damage from EF3s, and we can't eliminate the destruction of an EF4 or 5. But when you fortify a community, you can totally reduce the damage that you see at the periphery of a tornado, because a tornado changes. It's a life cycle, right, as it moves through the path. So where there's that EF3, 4, and 5, you are going to see terrible catastrophic damage. But when you get out to the periphery where there's EF0, 1, and 2, the science shows that we can absolutely eliminate the destruction in those areas. And I'm on a hotel internet, so that is why I'm moving so slow with these. And I'm just going to go. So just eliminate. That's the path of the Moore tornado in 2013. What if we eliminated the blue and the green and part of the yellow? Like the whole swath of destruction, just eliminated. I mean, it's significant because EF4s and 5s are really tiny specks when it comes to it. We always name it the highest. Whatever the tornado's highest level was, that's what it gets named. But those right there, that's where it was a 5. So we know it works. We've been doing this a long time now. Thomas and them are doing it, and Thomas and them are going to have amazing results that they're getting photographs of. Come on, internet. And we will be able to see that. Okay, so, oops, I didn't mean to do that.
It's okay.
So the feds recognize. So the last thing I want to say really quick, Janiele, is that HUD recognizes fortified, FEMA recognizes fortified, SBA increases homeowner loans by 20% after a disaster, 20% if they go fortified, and small businesses, 20% increase in that loan value if they go fortified. So I guess my biggest thing is everybody talked about all this stuff since yesterday, and I'm like, we're doing it.
That's why you're invited.
And it's working.
Yeah, thanks. So Tom, I wanted to let you comment on that. And I mean, we're behind you. We require that people retrofit in accordance with the code. And I will tell you that this is a better than life safety performance as well. And we see the same thing on the periphery of a large earthquake. It's just, there's no reason that we should have houses with that kind of serious structural damage.
Yeah, I think that's right. And candidly, I don't want to say much because I feel like I'll just dilute Julie's really passionate and poignant summary of how the needle that's being moved. I think, for SBP, there are a few audiences. There's certainly the homeowner, and there's the education, and there's that. But I think, where we get really excited is when we're at a round table after Ida or after Harvey, and there are, whether it's church groups or there's some appropriate mission creep for organizations that have been present in an affected community for a while, and we get to get this in front of them before they start, because it's good intention. It's good intention to quickly put something back, and it's good intention to hire, Joe with a truck to get the roof put back on. But the opportunity to educate, and to Julie's point, really show the very modest price increase, but the lasting effect that it has on homeowners, and especially as we understand from sort of a social equity perspective, the amount of personal net worth for homeowners of color that are tied into their property, and the opportunity for us to really challenge that in those communities that are affected, and for those homeowners that are at risk of losing the majority of their net worth because of this storm, where we can guide our partners and the community to really embrace this at a local level. It's just a game changer. And what we found from a fundraising perspective too is that people love this. Like, people will give us money to do this because it matters, and because they see it as, again, not a Band-Aid, but a lasting effect. It's really exciting.
Yeah. Well, Thomas and Julie, who are the sources of your financial resources?
So for SBP, we use like a bit of a cocktail. So much of it is federal money. When it comes to long-term recovery, we're leveraging the HUD dollars on behalf of the homeowners. The first 2 years of recovery, because of the slow pace of federal dollars, it's all philanthropic or local grants or some of our foundational partners. And so that's, for SBP, that's where most of ours comes from. Julie, how about you?
Most of ours comes from the foundational arms of the insurance industry. And then we have federal and state partners as well. So it's sort of a mix, but a lot of it is from the insurance industry because no one would know, right? So, I mean, all of what we do all year long is educate, 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 so that it's getting out there. And then we just work really, really hard to get it implemented at a code level, because that's what I talk about, like that quiet background, like it's happening. So for every one of those houses that are designated, the 17,000, there's like 5 to 6 on top of each one that didn't get designated because that's a homeowner voluntary thing. But I know that that house was either built or re-roofed to that fortified level. So that's that resiliency that's happening. It's just sort of in the quiet background.
Right. And when you get a fortified retrofit, do you receive any kind of a certificate or anything that you can hand it when you sell the house?
Yeah. And so the really important part in today's world right now about the clientele that SBP is impacting every day is that when they give that homeowner that fortified certificate, they're now eligible for private market insurance, because since Harvey, the insurance market has been hardening since Harvey, and it really took a hit last year. So all of those marginalized communities that struggle to even have insurance will most likely see a drop. They'll just be dropped, or they won't renew because they're in a high risk zone. I mean, everybody's been impacted. I mean, we've got people calling from South Carolina, North Carolina. They're losing their insurance, or they're not being renewed. The insurance market will write a fortified designated house because they've got that proof, right? It got designated, so they know that it meets that standard. So from an insurance perspective, they know they're writing a reduced risk in a high risk market. So it's, for right now in this moment in time, it's greater than just a premium reduction, which homeowners do see. It's the fact that it keeps them out of the wind pool if they're in a coastal state. Right. And gets them either out of that wind pool or gets them into that private market where they can get a better policy.
Right. And you now have data. I think that's what you're getting with one of your slides. You now have data from fortified homes that have been through various hurricanes. One of the problems, of course, that we have with earthquakes is that they're low probability. We don't have a lot of examples. And the data that we're relying on for a lot of things is the Northridge earthquake. And the Northridge earthquake, was a pencil and manila envelope system. So, unfortunately, the next really damaging earthquake, Napa and Ridgecrest didn't do that for us. That's not that I, as an earthquake person, am hoping for an earthquake to provide us with data. I'd prefer to have every house retrofitted and the data then is all fantastic. Yeah. Well, we've got just a couple of minutes, and I wanted to, let me check and make sure. Yeah, so one of the issues that we have, of course, in, on the West Coast is fire, is that people are losing their fire protection right and left. And of course, as we were talking earlier about a national disaster insurance and federal backing and all that, as an engineer, I always think, the idea is to get the smart home number, I don't know, kind of like a herd, herd protection. Right. And essentially, I think I can't remember who the FEMA administrator was, Craig Fugate, that said, essentially to build structures that are insurable, which is the idea behind, the above code. It's the idea behind fortified, is that we're talking about performance and not some minimum life safety standard. So we've got like just a couple of minutes. Thomas, I'll start with you, and then we'll let you guys kind of close out with any last thoughts.
Again, thanks for inviting SBP to be a part of this panel in this moment. I'm really excited not only to see SBP's evolution in this fortified and resilient space domestically, but really how we bring this to both Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, and soon to be St. Vincent. I mean, what's exciting about our soon-to-be program in St. Vincent is we're taking some of the lessons we've learned about building to a fortified standard and adapting for a completely different home construction type, and the opportunity to really begin the thinking process with local governments and ministries. And so pretty soon in St. Vincent, we're going to be able to harvest some of the volcano ash and develop a brick manufacturing program that'll be staffed by and run by residents that will produce the bricks that are needed at the strength required to create resilient structures that'll be both fireproof, at least from the exterior, or fire resistant rather. And so I'm really excited. Again, SVP has the benefit of leaning on Smart Home and their deep research and understanding and advocacy around this. And I'm excited to kind of be a part of SVP's own evolution. Again, thanks for having it. It's been really lovely to join. Julie?
Well, thank you.
This has been, you have to have those pep talks. And so, you have to have this, I call it like an inoculation. Like you go to certain conferences to go like, okay, I can do this. I can get up in the morning. I can keep fighting this battle that I feel like we are just losing every dang day. And so I will say that all of the talks since yesterday have given me like this boost. It's been fantastic to hear so many people saying, just saying some of the stuff that we say constantly when we're giving these presentations and when we're educating. And so I'm just really excited about the collective that everybody, we all see. To me, this is our time. Like this is that moment in time for mitigation and resilience. And I really am hopeful that all of our collective will keep just solving the problems that we just don't have any excuse anymore. Like we just simply know how to build and retrofit structures to take it over and over and over again. We just know. And I think all of the things that we've talked about since yesterday, we are getting those answers slowly but surely. And I'm just very grateful that I feel better, because I remember when you and I talked, I was like, now, Janelle, I don't know if I have anything to like provide with this group. I'm like, we don't do anything with earthquake. And you were like, don't worry about it.
Yeah. There's this other big thing that drops in on people from time to time.
Right.
Dumps a lot of water.
Right. But this has been a privilege. So thank you very much for having us along.
Well, thank you both, and thank you to both of your organizations, and of course, those of us who are not, underwater right now. Wish everyone in the affected areas our very best, and to you and your families as well. Thank you so much. Thanks. Well, we are at our closing, and I enjoyed that so much last night with Cheryl, that I'm inviting Cheryl back to help me. She's much better at the closure, but I wanted to just let you know of something. I wrote to Glenn during the break because somebody was talking about the use of taxes and tax exemptions and tax refunds and things. And so I just want to let you know that there is a legislative proposal that we're supporting that would make state-funded mitigation grants that includes earthquake, wind, and fire non-taxable at the federal level. So it's important to note non-taxable, just like the FEMA Stafford Act funding is. And it will almost certainly be inserted into the 2,600 some pages of the $3.5 trillion budget bill that will soon be the subject of intense debate in Washington. And so once the House passes the budget, it'll go over to the Senate, at which time, if you would like, you could contact your senator. So there is more information if you go to, so it's Representative Thompson from California, and Senators Feinstein and Padilla from California. Both of the senators from North Carolina and it has bipartisan support, particularly from, well, name a state that doesn't have a natural disaster. But let me just give you an example here. So when we use our funding, or we use state funding for our retrofit program for earthquake, brace, and bolt, we have to send a 1099 so that they can report that to the government to tax, not at the state level, but the federal level. If we give them a FEMA grant, that is Stafford Act funding, and it is not taxable. So that is the issue here, is parity and you know, the idea to encourage and to provide incentives. So just a little note there that that's another area that we're trying to promote resilience. So sorry about that, Cheryl. I welcome you back. And Charlotte, I welcome you back as well, because I wanted you to jump in with a voice if you had any questions for Cheryl as she goes along. But Cheryl, I'll turn it back over to you to do the great job that you did last night on summarizing these incredible speakers.
Thank you. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here again, an honor. And I don't know how I can possibly do justice to it. Everyone has contributed, like Julie just said, you know, a lot of inspiration and validation. And when I've worked with public policy, you know, undergraduate and master's students in the past, I often tell them that getting into public policy is kind of a dangerous job title, as strange as that may sound, but it's just, we're working in the long game kind of issues. And you're not going to maybe see the big successes, the big changes. You know, maybe you will across your entire career, but what keeps you going on a day-to-day basis are the people you work with, you know, celebrating the small wins. That's how you avoid burnout and keep yourself going. So that's been my experience as well. So this kind of a convening really does that. In the morning, we heard, I heard Dr. Kousky talk. It was basically a walk through my dissertation from 10 years ago. It was so lovely to see that encapsulated so articulately. And her focus was on what's the role of insurance in our toolkit? Because, you know, CEA is primarily an insurance organization, although it does have an educate and mitigate mandate as well. But you guys kind of have finally admitted that you are not going to be able to go it alone. You know, it's only got its appropriate role. So it was really interesting to hear a very nuanced discussion of that from Carolyn. Laurie, Schoeman, I mean, I was reminded again that the experts in our field, the technical engineers, the emergency managers, the financial industry managers, you know, we have a lot of work to do to get up to speed on the other policy arenas where we want to make a difference. So I appreciated that from your talk, Laurie, and I also loved how you talked about the Community Reinvestment Act. You threw out that little acronym CRA, and it's just another point of leverage on practices in the financial industry. That law says that banks and insurers cannot merge or acquire without demonstrating the equitable availability, offering of credit, and financial services in a wide range of communities. So that's a stick that we don't use quite enough. I feel like we have Charlotte here, and I really want to hear you respond to the day too. So maybe I'll save a few of my comments about the thoughts that were evoked for me on the other people's talks. And why don't you chime in, Charlotte?
I thought it's been really inspiring. It's great to see, you know, the whole picture, and Cheryl, you'll probably agree, just to see all the different aspects of this. I was really impressed with all the stuff that we just heard from the last panel on basically a Build Back Better mode that is actually happening. And I thought that was really gratifying to see. Yes, it's not earthquakes, but it's still disasters. It's still people who have to deal with this. The challenge, of course, that we're facing is how you get homes. You know, I think it's easy to get them. It's easier. Nothing is easy in this space, but it's easier to get people to be more receptive once there has been an Ida, once there has been a disaster, for people to understand that, yes, we need to do better, and just building back how we've always done it isn't going to work. So we need better standards, etc. Our challenge, of course, is that we have a lot of more than 1 million homes in California. We don't want there to be a disaster. We don't want them to have to suffer through the earthquake before they take the action. And so, you know, it's it's that little subtle difference that it's, but it's everything that we've been talking about. How do we get our message across to people? And more importantly, how do we make sure that what they need is what we're telling them, so that we're not sort of coming from our point of view, but trying to weave in their concerns as well. And as somebody said, I think it was in the chat, when you talk about low income groups, there's research that shows that some families have $400 as an emergency fund, and even for them to come up with that is a challenge. So then when there's wealthier families or families that have got a higher income level who don't take insurance, who don't retrofit their homes for whatever reasons, they don't do that. We know only about maybe 10 to 15% have earthquake insurance. How do you then get that message across to these other families who have even less money available? So, but it's just been fascinating, I think, hearing all of this. And it's been really inspiring for me, because sometimes I sit there and I think, oh my God, we're never going to do this. I mean, I don't know how Janiele and EBB have done 15,000 homes already. And then hearing this wider landscape, I think it's just really inspiring that there's so many people working in this field. And it's one step at a time, but at the same time, it's big policy changes that also need to happen. So it's tackling it from all angles. And I think it's been a great 2 days, really, really great.
Thank you for that, Charlotte. Janiele, maybe this is a good time for me to pepper in something I thought I might bring up, which is that so often when we come to this kind of event, we're kind of constrained in that we have a particular position in this space. I'm a consultant. I work so many hours a week. There's certain kinds of things I can work on and certain kinds of things I can't. CEA has a legislative mandate, that it cannot go outside. It has certain budget, laws need to be passed in order for you to change the scope of what you're doing. So it's easy to get kind of stuck within that, because we see the things that are outside our formal abilities, and we know, I'd rather be doing that. Rather be doing that. So we have to both adapt current programs in the directions we know we need to go. Sometimes that's tweaking formal authority, shifting budgets from one thing to another, but we also sometimes have to create new efforts. And what I thought I heard yesterday people saying is that, sometimes you have to go to the community that you're seeking to reach and ask, what are you worried about? What are you trying to work on? How can we help? And two things, like, how do we create that freedom within our organizations and our work lives? How does doing that get written into your job descriptions, Janiele? How do we carve out part of your time to engage in that kind of program development as opposed to the tweaking the programs that we have now? So that's like just a big picture organizational question for you guys to reflect on, for each of us to go back and reflect on. How do we create potential in our own workforce to work in that way? And just as a thought experiment, I have a couple of things I want to ask the audience to participate and interact with us on in the next 30, 40 minutes. Let's do a thought experiment, each of us, in relation to our own work. Think of a community that you would like your work to make a difference to. Reflect on a group out there in society that has need of your services, you think, and try to think about what you would ask, how you would start that relationship. How would you start that conversation? What would be your access point? And what kind of common ground could you possibly imagine could be created out of that new conversation? Janiele, help me if that question isn't clear enough. I can give an example, but just think big picture. What's a group that you would like your work to make more of a difference for? How would you start that conversation? we'll kind of brainstorm potential connections between their mission and your mission.
Yeah. So when you say group, so obviously, you know, the group that we consider to be our clients are people who are living in older homes that are vulnerable to earthquake damage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as kind of the broad brush, that's a group. Within that group, though, when I feel the best about what we're doing is when I talk to the senior, retired couple that wants to stay in that home, and in Los Angeles was able, with our $3,000 grant, to retrofit with just a couple $100 out of pocket. And with our supplementary grant, that's what we want to have, right? The person who puts their young daughter and her husband into their second home. They only own 2 houses in the whole world. Put their daughter and son into another house, and we can't retrofit that house through our program because we're going to have to change legislation to make it so that we can do renters. Essentially, it doesn't have to be owner occupied. So there is a subgroup within that group of people living in the older homes that I really, really want to connect with. And I don't think personally I can. So Cheryl, what I'm thinking is there are groups out there already that have a connection to them that if I could partner with.
Yeah. So let me give you, let me just kind of try and riff on that. All right. I have elementary age children. I'm really worried about teachers. There's not enough teachers for my class, for the classrooms right now.
Yeah.
What does this have to do with vulnerable housing? Well, I know a lot of teachers don't live where they teach.
Right.
They live in older homes if they own a home or they rent. How could I work with the teachers union to get the word out about my retrofit program?
Right.
Because I know that teachers union contains a subset of the group that you're thinking about.
Yeah.
Not all of them.
Yeah.
But just, try to make it so specific that you can really think about who would I call.
Right. Right.
I'm going to call the union, the California Teachers Association, and tell them that I think their teacher population has some vulnerability. Would they like to help work with us to deliver value to their members by helping them protect their housing?
Yeah.
And just what a lot of social good, that's the kind of brainstorming I'm trying to encourage here. What existing networks of trust and community organizing and information flow can we capitalize on?
Right. Right. And of course, the other thing that I'm acutely aware of, and if you were to replay the tape, go back to this morning when I talked about the resiliency of my family during the pandemic, I will readily admit, I understand that was a privileged experience. That is a privileged experience that my husband and I were able to work in our home. Our kids were able to work in their homes. They have health care to take care of themselves and their children. That is a privileged perspective on resilience during the pandemic. I didn't have food in my cupboard, not because I couldn't pay for it, but I just hadn't put food in my cupboard. And so the large sector of the population that doesn't live in that privileged world, I don't live in. And so I know very, very well that I need to find groups that can help us communicate. And as you said, to go in and ask, what are you worried about? How can we think this is important, but how could we bring you this program and have it be an asset enough and not a burden?
Yeah.
And if I could add something to that, the challenge that we have found this year as we started to do just some outreach into what I would consider low-income grassroots community organizations just in the Los Angeles region was that this year, all they really wanted to talk about was COVID. You ask, what are you concerned about, and how we can try and help. COVID covered everything. That was first and foremost. It was I've only been here just over a year, but I suspect this year was harder to make that breakthrough than it probably would have been on a normal year because the COVID message just so all the organizations and the churches and all of those kind of organizations that we reached out to, we did, and I've got to give my coworker Pamela a lot of credit too, because we did do a lot of outreach. And we got together, I think 30 or 40 organizations together for a meeting, but it really was like pulling teeth trying to get beyond that COVID message, because that was just front and center. But it's interesting, something you just said, Cheryl, just again, light bulb idea. I don't know whether this would work or not, but and I need to formulate it more, but you just talked about how teachers, right? You just, well, of course, they're all the first responders and people who've worked during this COVID era to help save our lives. And I wonder if there's a way of us packaging up what we're offering to make it attractive to, in other words, it's open to everybody, right? Our retrofit grants, et cetera, if you live in these zip codes. But maybe we do something special where we say, especially if you're a first responder, we really want to hear from you, or,
right.
It's a lottery program, I get, so we can't necessarily give them
no,
an
but
advantage.
it's a way of categorizing
right.
your outreach.
That was just that
efforts.
light bulb that went off as you were talking there.
Yeah, I think that would resonate with a lot of people. Sometimes as a government agency, you have obligations, to advertise in a really fair, non-prioritized way. But as Carolyn said this morning, there's a role for means testing here in our suite of programs. There's also a role for, group focus, group emphasis or prioritization. And that's not just because they deserve it. It's because it really helps the information and the relationship building that is going to lead to a more impactful program and higher uptake.
Yeah.
So Janiele and I were brainstorming. No one's taking me up on my offer in the chat yet to think of an audience that they want to reach. How could we imagine a program cross-section that would serve them or not? Okay, Charlotte wants to go.
Again, so an idea, and I have to give Anna Marie credit for this because we were talking once before, and she sparked this idea in my head, which we have not yet been able to do because of COVID, basically. But wouldn't it be fabulous if we went to a church? I'm just going to use a church, but it could be any institution of faith, but I'll just use a church, for instance, in one of our zip codes, and we said to this church, okay, we know that you've got, let's just say, 300 homes that are older, that fit our, pre-1940, need retrofitting, etc. You as the pastor of this church are going to take the stance that when an earthquake happens, my congregation will be prepared. That is our message, right? We're about saving souls and everything else religiously, but we are also going to take the stance that when this disaster happens, we are not going to be like so many neighborhoods that are not prepared. And you almost have like a church day where you sign people up actively. We see A's out there helping them fill out all the forms. We go in, we talk, I think it would just be, again, so much easier if we could do that kind of thing practically, physically, where you can therefore make it local and there's a sense of ownership, a sense of community, that this is what we're going to do. This is the stance that we're going to take.
Well, I will just slow you down a tiny bit and try and bring back some of the advice we've heard over the past wonderful rich days. And that is, did you stop and ask the question of the pastor and their key elders and volunteers, what are you trying to work on? They might tell you COVID is the emergency we're focused on right now, or it's food delivery because we have a lot of people who are, or it's rental, it's evictions. Just take it deep enough that you hear their agenda and then look for the overlap inside of their existing agenda. Don't try and add a new bullet point to their agenda. And the beauty of doing that is it makes the idea so specific and actionable. It forces you to brainstorm in that very specific space. We have a soup kitchen program that runs on Thursdays. Okay, well, so if we're going to come and talk about, home hazard safety checklist, we can come on Thursday nights and pass that out along with the literature that would read that. I'm just brainstorming off the cuff here, but you're going to see the how you would do it when you get to that level of specificity. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so in the chats, a couple people have taken us up on it. They say mobile homes. So mobile home dwellers, owners, renters, there's a mix there for sure. And I know CEA mobile homes is in your purview, right?
Well, in our
I can't remember.
So we do
remember.
provide insurance to mobile home owners. The problem that I'm having with mobile homes is that, this is just an honest appraisal of the existing bracing system hasn't done very well in recent earthquakes. And so I think there's some research.
You're not sure what technically you're able to offer that group quite yet?
Exactly. Yeah. And what we found in earthquake brace and bolt is it's very important to have a code standard is the very best, because that is a consensus document that was arrived at, by, all the processes that allow for public review. And so I will tell you that with other groups, I have put in applications for grants to do mobile home studies on that twice now, and we haven't gotten it. So I haven't given up. So if there are people who, think that there is a grant that is just perfect for that, I've got the people who want to do it.
Okay. So where do mobile home dwellers gather? Are there any associations? Are there any community organizations? Are there any groups or places? I mean, I need to educate myself. How does a mobile home park operate administratively? What kind of legal obligations does it have? Does it have to have a little board, that makes decisions about the use of it, or is it an independent landlord? Like, I need to get up to speed before I can brainstorm effectively how to reach this group of people. So I'm going to go ask anybody I know who's lived in a mobile home. I'm going to try and identify some. Maybe I can go to the building official, but we have to find that space, where that group, and it might literally be the physical space. Like, let's make a map of all of these locations in our communities. And I bet a lot of cities have them.
Yeah, I mean, I looked up on the census how many mobile homes were in California, and it was, it's 500,000 out of, I think, 11. I can't remember how many millions of homes. 40 million people, 14 million dwellings in California. But sizable number and disproportionately affected. I mean, if we have a column of disproportionately affected by disasters, it is people who reside in, and let's, older, unbraced mobile homes. Yeah.
Okay. So where do we have access to that population? What
housing and community development?
News. What news outlets do they use?
Yeah.
What help me out here in the chat, guys, because I'm really just showing how much creativity and imagination and trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Program development can really be like. I'm thinking about grocery stores. I'm thinking about Targets. I'm thinking about just touch points where people might be going, maybe local clinics, health clinics, farmers markets, maybe not in a hot place like Rancho Mirage.
And I think that for some communities, it probably, Ridgecrest, I think there were large percentages of renters in the mobile homes. And so there might be renters support groups that would be a good way. But let me throw this back at you, Cheryl. A question for you is, in all of this, and of course, I dabble a little bit in code development now, and the affordable housing starts to become a tool against retrofit. It starts to become something that's used, that if we require, let me give you an example. If you have houses that are damaged in an earthquake, somebody could be paying, someone might have earthquake insurance that has code upgrade and be surprised to find that the code upgrade will pay for any electrical or mechanical upgrades, maybe tempered glass, but there will be no seismic upgrades required of them because there are none no triggers in the code for that. They'll probably be surprised at that, but that's the
Yeah.
reality. And when you ask people, affordable housing are the two words that come out as to why these triggers don't exist in the code.
Yeah, I've encountered that a lot talking to owners too. If you raise the bar on quality, quantity, and or affordability are going to be affected. Housing works like a triangle like that.
Yep.
There's how
Yep.
much, how good, and how much, and how many.
Right.
So though you can't tip one piece of that triangle without affecting them all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and in our fantasy world that we're concocting here over these 2 days of your triangle, if we in fact had, mitigated houses, and we might have affordable insurance, and therefore we might have code upgrade protection. I mean, it's.
Yeah. Geez. It's hard to find a way forward through that other than public subsidy. So if you are unable to afford, or if we think there's going to be a price impact of that higher level mandate, some public source is going to come in to help make it up. Eventually, what you hope is that the market compensates higher quality. So the person who made that investment will get that money back.
Yeah.
Or everybody's property values in the region raise high enough. But it's really hard. It's a market failure.
Well, I do want to go back to Ed Thomas has a great point though in his chat about how he lives in Rancho Mirage, which tends to have maybe a higher income, but that he does have neighbors who are living in these mobile homes who are generally of lower income. And I think that's the other thing is that you can have mobile home and manufactured home communities in areas that they're a small part of that community and therefore of a small voice, but they are in fact lower income. They may be renters, they may be fixed income seniors. So definitely a community that is on my radar. I just have this impediment, I think, between putting together a program.
If you don't know quite what to say to a particular group, let me just point out, I love how Sara earlier was talking about different models of communication and models of risk perception and behavior and preparedness actions. Some of the godmothers and godfathers of that field, and Bostrom and others, have talked in some of their books about there being sort of 3 levels to risk communication. The first being when the risk is so well understood that you can just tell people what to do. Go wear sunscreen. There's really no ifs, ands, or but about it. Maybe there's a little nuance, what times a day you most need to have it on, but it's, you can really be confident as an expert that you're doing a really good thing by just giving this instruction. That code people might be familiar is a prescription. You prescribe the minimum bar, the behavior you want, thing that you want to see exist. The next level is numbers. So, you can make a model that predicts something. You can offer some statistics. You can, describe differences in probability, or maybe map some different colors. Like, you have to convey some nuance, maybe about the level of understanding of something. And man, did we see that in pandemic communication. Like, it wasn't easy to give people a prescription because the state of the understanding of the risk was evolving so fast.
That's right.
Now that brings you to the third level, which is risk dialogue. So when managing the risk becomes complex enough, either because your understanding of the risk is changing so much, or people will need time, and institutions need time to figure out ways to navigate, that's a conversation with the public. How do we feel about this level of risk? What is the acceptable level of risk? How much intrusion into our personal lives are we willing to accept to manage this list? So different risk issues at different points in our trajectory with them are going to be in different points of that conversation sphere. So maybe you're a little bit more in, you know, the conversational space with that group.
Yeah, yeah.
You're not talking about prescriptions. Or backing off the theory a little bit, Anne Marie's suggestion yesterday, go to personal preparedness first. Like, stop talking about the structure, just talk about what kind of physical risk do you feel in your safety, in your home, you know, in your shelter that you're trying to stabilize for you and your loved ones, and talk about personal preparedness. And that might be a good tip for you too. You know, that's the gateway towards talking about the physical structure and meeting water and power and sewage kind of needs as a community, not just structure by structure. We're reducing fire risk for that facility, not just structure by structure. Start with the personal preparedness. Start with, do you know if your neighbor has mobility needs? So they're going to need some assistance if there's an evacuation necessary on the property. Do you know that about your neighbors? Do you want to have something that helps address that small need? That becomes a gateway to thinking about, wow, I really can do something for myself and for other people like me on this issue.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's what I got for you on that. Tribal communities, someone just brought up in the chat. I think that's an excellent question. What did Stephanie say here? Yeah. So where's an access point to that community? You know, how do we collect information to understand there may be many among us who have personal experience or connections? Start exploring there. Can we imagine a tribal focused effort that relates to CEA's mission?
Well, I have. So when we first started in Humboldt County with Earthquake Brace Humboldt, and we're not in all of Humboldt County, I went, you know, I always do this, I kind of do a drive-through on Google Earth or Google Maps, and realized that a large percentage of Humboldt County actually is tribal land, and wanted to learn a little bit about it. So I went to their website, and it's interesting because one of the resources that they have on their lands is they build manufactured homes. And so when I started driving around the community, and not all of their streets are mapped, I started to realize a lot of the citizens of that area are living in these manufactured homes that they're making. So I'm certainly hoping that they're being anchored properly. But realized that they had a council, and if we get to the point where we would be in their area, would absolutely make contact with them to find out, you know, what kind of homes do you have, what kind of needs do you have. But when you look at in California, when you look at indigenous people, there are many people who are not living on tribal lands, and so that is a much more diffuse group that would take. We'll have to obviously do our homework for that. Absolutely. I mean, obviously there are casinos that are representing, you know, particular tribes. They tend to be outside of the main urban areas, and we weren't there yet, but we're closing in on those areas. So those are certainly opportunities for us to understand.
Gosh, doesn't that just invite a quirky, humorous little ad campaign about rolling the dice and risk? Exactly. And just that there's gotta be, put your marketing people on that, please, because there's gotta be some hook. Look at how many people go there.
That's right.
The subtlety of developing a communication campaign that went to employees and visitors and owners of casinos would be to get it right, to not, as Sarah was saying, not make that insensitive joke that really turned people off on their product or made them feel self-conscious. That taking risk can be something that people enjoy, and you don't want to, you'd really have to explore that carefully. But that's just kind of an intriguing, very specific market and pathway.
Yeah. Well, I could say to management of a casino, your customers may come in and roll the dice, but when your employees go home to an older home that's not, properly retrofitted for earthquakes, that's not those are not the odds that you want to battle. And of course, you and I have long talked about my theory that, the high tech companies have these amazing buildings that no one's going to work in anymore. And all these employees are not going to be working out of in their beautiful pre-1940 bungalow that's not retrofitted. That's now their house and their office. So I think that employers in general have, a great opportunity to provide some service to their to their employees about this.
Okay, so let's talk about employers. Who do you go to in the company? Do you go to the CEO? I might go to the human resources person.
Well, they're also
and increasingly there are people, like the CEOP, the chief culture person. Help me out here in the chat. There's a new vogue in the IT world about, the chief people manager. And I think that's the person who might see that offering this as a benefit, the company watching out for its employees in this way, is something else they can offer them to be a little more competitive. So I think we've given a lot of examples of just kind of how to let yourself brainstorm and fumble around, thinking about a way in, thinking about a way to look for mission overlap as a conversation starter. So hopefully each of you can take some of that home to your own scope of work and think about where you might apply some of that.
I wanted to answer Mark. I think we should actually close up pretty soon because I'm just watching the numbers go down. But Mark, I think that I am, how old am I? I will be turning 65 soon. So I am in what I call my swan song years. And I would like nothing more than to spend the next 4 or 5 years on this project and all in person, talking to groups at churches and at city council meetings. It is something that I am passionate about. The pandemic obviously has put a tremendous crimp on that. I'm really hoping that we will be able to do, and it may not be door to door, but it'll be door to door of organizations that we can partner with. I always say I do my best work in person, and Cheryl and I, we've talked about this so many times. I do my best work because not only is my mouth there, but my ears and my eyes are there as well. And it's an opportunity to hear and to understand. And then people ask me specific questions about their houses. So I get a sense of how real people, understand their house. Like they look at the wood floor in their kitchen and think it's a wood framed house. And of course, we're talking about what's holding up the house. So really looking forward to, as we roll out this supplementary grant, to being able to face-to-face interface so that we can better understand who this new client and hopefully this growing list of clients are. So I'm seeing lots of thank you, Cheryl. So I'm gonna give you the last couple of seconds, and then I'm gonna say one last thing, and we'll wish everyone their very best.
Well, I know it's always hard to concentrate, especially over Zoom for this many hours, but I feel it has truly been worth it for me. I hope everyone in the audience feels the same. I'm going to leave you though with one call to action for yourself, as if you can possibly marshal in before you check your email or move away from the screen. My challenge is to create a post-forum follow-up for yourself. And it can be the thing that you just do now or can do within a day or so. Just some ideas write it down, because people who write down their goals and plans are 80% more likely to achieve them. Is it linking someone that you heard talk today? Is it downloading a paper or setting some time aside in your calendar to educate yourself about a new term you heard or look up somebody's program? Is it calling a vendor and asking an equity focused question? Is it joining a listserv or a network like Resilience 21? Think of that thing that this event made you say, oh, I could do that, and get that action step written down. That's what I invite for each of you to do. And we'll reconvene and see what we've accomplished next year, next time.
Wonderful.
Thank
And
you so much.
Andy Everton has already, as I said, looked to make sure that we have an ASL translator at our rollout for EBB. Thank you all. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope that you'll all join me next year when we have a field trip to the Truckee River for the physics float. Thanks so much. Nice to hear from you all.